I have known about the apartment for 14 months. I knew about it before I ever said a word to my husband about it, before I ever let my face change at the dinner table, before I ever asked him how his day was in a voice that didn't shake. 14 months of knowing the exact address, the exact unit number, the exact hour he parked his car 3 streets away so the doorman wouldn't recognize the make and model twice in 1 week. 14 months of watching him take his wedding ring off on Friday nights and set it in the little blue velvet box on his nightstand, telling me his finger swells after a long week, and 14 months of picking that ring up every Saturday morning while he was in the shower and turning it over in my hand, reading the engraving inside the band, the date of our wedding, the 2 words we chose together, always us, and feeling absolutely nothing move in my chest anymore. Because grief, real grief, the kind that guts you, only lasts so long before it hardens into something else entirely. What replaces it, in my experience, is far more useful. I did not scream. I did not throw his belongings onto the front lawn in a fit that the neighbors would talk about for a year. I did not slash a single tire or key a single door panel or send one single text message that would have given him the satisfaction of a reaction. Instead, I did something that surprised even me, something I am still, some days, a little frightened by. I got quiet. I got so quiet that my husband, a man who has known me for 18 years and been married to me for 16 of them, never once suspected that the woman making his coffee every morning, packing his lunch, laughing at his jokes at his mother's Sunday dinners, was a woman who had already, months earlier, hired a lawyer, opened a separate bank account, photographed every document in our shared filing cabinet, and quietly built a case so complete that when I finally chose to detonate it, I chose the exact night, the exact room, and the exact audience myself. This is the story of those 14 months. And I want to start not with the apartment, because the apartment isn't really where it began. I want to start with a ring box. My name is Elaine Hargrove. I am 42 years old, and until 14 months ago, I would have told you, without hesitation, that my marriage was a good one. Not perfect. No marriage is perfect after 16 years. 2 children, a mortgage, and the particular slow erosion that happens when 2 people stop being new to each other and start being furniture to each other instead. But good. Solid. The kind of marriage other women at school pickup would sometimes mention with a small, envious sigh. You 2 seem so easy together, Elaine, like you actually still like each other. I teach 4th grade at Cedar Falls Elementary on the north side of town, the same school I attended as a girl, which people find either charming or slightly sad depending on how much ambition they think a person is supposed to have by 42. I have taught there for 17 years. I know every squeaky floorboard in that building. I know which radiator in room 14 clangs like a dying appliance every October when the heat first comes on. And I know, better than almost anyone in this town, how to read a room full of people who are trying very hard not to let you see what they're actually feeling. 9 and 10-year-olds are terrible liars. They give themselves away in a dozen small tells before they ever say a word. I want you to remember that fact because it matters more to this story than you might expect right now. My husband is Marcus Hargrove, 45 years old, regional sales manager for Brannigan Supply Company, an industrial equipment distributor headquartered here in Cedar Falls, Ohio, a mid-sized town of about 31,000 people. The kind of place where everyone's second cousin works with your dentist's brother and nothing stays a secret for very long, or so I used to believe. Marcus covers a territory that stretches across 4 counties, which means he is on the road 2, sometimes 3 nights a week, has been for the 11 years he's held that position. And I want to be honest that this travel schedule was never in itself something I found suspicious, because it had been true of our marriage for over a decade before any of what I'm about to tell you started. We met in our mid-20s at a mutual friend's barbecue, back when Marcus still had a full head of dark hair he now jokes wistfully about in the mirror, and back when I was teaching my first year of 2nd grade and still cried in my car some afternoons from sheer exhaustion. He made me laugh so hard at that barbecue that I spilled an entire plate of potato salad down the front of my shirt, and he took his own jacket off and handed it to me without a word of teasing, which I remember thinking, even then, was the single most attractive thing a man had ever done in front of me. We married 2 years later, in a small ceremony at the Methodist Church on Grant Street. 60 guests, my father walking me down the aisle in the same suit he wore to my sister's wedding 4 years earlier because he refused to buy a new one. And Marcus, I remember this clearly, crying before I even reached the altar, the same way plenty of grooms do. And I remember thinking that a man who cried that easily, that openly, in front of 60 people, was a man who would never be able to hide anything from me. I want you to sit with that thought for a moment, because it is going to come back around later in this story in a way that still, even now, makes me feel something close to embarrassment at my own younger certainty. We have 2 children. Josh, who is 15 now, a sophomore at Cedar Falls High, quiet and serious in the particular way that firstborns sometimes are, obsessed with a video game he and his friends play online most evenings, the kind of teenager who still, without prompting, tells me he loves me before he goes up to his room at night, a habit I hope he never grows out of and suspect, with a familiar ache, that he eventually will. And Maddie, who is 11, in her last year of elementary school, though not at the school where I teach, because we made a decision years ago that having your mother as a hallway presence was not a gift either of our children particularly wanted, and Maddie has never once let me forget that decision was, in her words, the smartest thing we ever did as parents. Maddie is loud where Josh is quiet, opinionated where he is careful, the kind of 11-year-old who has already declared she intends to be a marine biologist, a lawyer, or the mayor of Cedar Falls, and has not yet decided which, and possibly intends to do all 3. Our house is a modest 4-bedroom colonial on Larkspur Lane, in a neighborhood built in the early 2000s, the kind of street with sidewalk chalk drawings that survive exactly one rainstorm, and a neighborhood association that argues, with real passion, about mailbox colors. It is, in every visible way, an ordinary, comfortable, unremarkable American life. I want you to hold on to that ordinariness because it is the exact backdrop against which everything else in this story took place, quietly, for 14 months, without a single person in that neighborhood, that school, or that extended family ever suspecting a thing. I found out about the apartment on a Tuesday afternoon in March, 14 months before the night I am about to describe to you in full, and I found out, entirely by accident, in the most mundane way imaginable, which I have come to believe is how most people actually discover the truth about their marriages. Not through some dramatic confrontation, not through a hired detective with a folder of photographs, but through a stray envelope that arrives at the wrong time, a phone left unlocked on a kitchen counter for 4 unguarded seconds, a receipt that falls out of a jacket pocket into the dryer lint trap. In my case, it was a credit card statement. Marcus had, years earlier, opened a secondary credit card in his own name only, which he explained at the time, reasonably enough, as a business expense card for client dinners and territory travel that Brannigan Supply would reimburse him for, separate from our joint household accounts so the bookkeeping wouldn't get confused. I had never once looked at a statement from that card in 11 years, because I had never once had a reason to, because it was, as far as I understood our marriage, simply a piece of his work life that didn't intersect with mine, the same way I never looked closely at his sales territory maps or his quarterly performance reviews. But that particular March, Brannigan Supply switched accounting software company-wide, and in the confusion of the transition, a paper statement that should have gone to his work email instead arrived at our house, addressed to him, and I opened it without thinking, the way you open any piece of mail addressed to your own household, because in 16 years of marriage I had never once considered that opening my husband's mail was an act that required permission. The statement had a recurring monthly charge on it, the same amount, the same date range every month, going back as far as the 12 months the statement covered. $1,420 on the first of every month to an entity called Birchwood Commons Property Management, LLC. I remember standing in my own kitchen, Maddie's backpack still slung over one of the chairs from being dropped there after school, a pot of water not yet boiling on the stove behind me, staring at that line item and feeling, before I had even consciously worked out what it meant, a cold drop somewhere low in my stomach, the specific physical sensation of your body understanding something a full 30 seconds before your mind catches up and agrees to know it too. Birchwood Commons. I knew the name. Everyone in Cedar Falls knew the name. It was a mid-range apartment complex off Elm Ridge Road. Nice enough, not luxurious. The kind of place young professionals rented before they bought their first house, or the kind of place people rented in the messy months right after a divorce. $1,420 a month, every month for 12 consecutive months, on a card I had never looked at, tied to an address that had absolutely nothing to do with any client account, any sales territory, any business explanation I could construct in my head no matter how many times I turned it over. I did not confront him that night. I want to be very honest about the sequence of what actually happened in me, because I think it matters, and because I think most people who have never lived through this assume the discovery and the confrontation happen close together, within days, maybe a week at most, driven by an emotional urgency that simply cannot wait. That is not what happened to me. What happened to me was that I stood in that kitchen for what felt like a long time, water eventually boiling over unattended behind me, hissing against the stovetop, and I made a decision so fast and so completely that I didn't even experience it as a decision, more like discovering a fact about myself I hadn't previously had occasion to learn. I decided I was not going to say one single word until I understood everything, not the broad shape of it. Everything, every date, every dollar, every name if there was a name attached to it, every possible legal and financial consequence, before I gave my husband the smallest hint that anything in our house had changed. I turned off the stove, I threw away the ruined pot of pasta water, I made Maddie a grilled cheese sandwich instead because it was faster, and when Marcus came home from a 2-day territory trip that same evening, tired and cheerful, kissing me on the top of the head the way he always did, asking what was for dinner, I looked at him and said, "Leftover chili, is that okay?" And he said, "That sounds great." And I watched him hang his jacket on the hook by the door, the same jacket I now understood with a strange, detached clarity that he had likely worn into that apartment on Elm Ridge Road at some point in the last 12 months. And I felt something in my chest go very still and very cold and very, very patient. I want to describe the ring ritual now, because it is the detail that, once I understood everything else, retroactively became the cruelest part of the entire 14 months, crueler in some ways than the apartment itself. Marcus had, for as long as I can remember, at least the last 6 or 7 years of our marriage, a habit of taking his wedding ring off on Friday nights before bed. He told me early on that his fingers swelled slightly after a long work week, something about sodium intake and sitting in a car for hours at a time, and that the ring felt tight and uncomfortable by Friday evening in a way it didn't the rest of the week. I had no reason to doubt this. I had, if anything, found it sweetly domestic, the specific tenderness of watching a grown man carefully place his wedding ring into a small blue velvet box we kept on his nightstand, a box that had originally held a pair of cufflinks his father gave him and had been repurposed years ago for this exact Friday night ritual. Every Saturday morning while he showered, I would sometimes pick that ring up, almost without thinking, the way you touch a familiar object in passing, and read the engraving inside the band that I had chosen myself at the jeweler's counter 16 years earlier, the date of our wedding, and beneath it 2 words, "Always Us." I want you to understand that for years, picking up that ring on a Saturday morning was one of the small unconscious gestures of my marriage, a tiny private ritual that meant nothing more than affection on autopilot. After the credit card statement, I picked up that ring on a Saturday morning and understood, for the first time, with a clarity that made my hands go cold, that a man does not take his wedding ring off every single Friday night for 14 consecutive months because his fingers swell. A man takes his wedding ring off every Friday night because Friday night is the night he goes somewhere that ring cannot go with him. I did not stop the ritual. I want to be honest about that too, because I think it says something important about the kind of quiet I chose to keep for the next 14 months. I kept placing that ring back in its box every Saturday morning, exactly the way I always had, kept never mentioning it, kept letting Marcus believe that his wife noticed nothing, understood nothing, suspected nothing, while underneath that unchanged surface routine I was building, week by week, a case. The first thing I did before I told a single living soul was open a post office box at the branch on Fenwick Avenue, across town from our usual branch, paying the annual fee in cash from money I quietly set aside from my own teacher's salary over the following 6 weeks, small enough amounts that they would never show up as a noticeable dip in our joint checking account. I began having certain documents, certain statements, certain pieces of mail that I requested duplicate copies of directly from institutions, sent there instead of to the house. The second thing I did was call my college roommate, Denise Okafor, who had gone through her own divorce 8 years earlier, badly, expensively, and who I knew, better than anyone else in my life, would not tell me to calm down, would not tell me I must be misunderstanding something, would not, under any circumstances, accidentally let something slip to Marcus at some future barbecue. Denise picked up on the second ring, the way she always does, some instinct in her voice immediately recognizing that this was not a normal Tuesday phone call, and when I told her, in a voice I kept remarkably steady about the credit card statement, she was quiet for a long moment and then said, the first thing out of her mouth, "Elaine, do not say one word to him yet. Not one word. I know you. I know you want to march in there tonight and demand answers, and I am telling you, as someone who did exactly that 8 years ago and lost $11,000 in assets I still can't fully account for because I gave my ex 4 days of warning before I ever spoke to a lawyer, do not do that. Find out everything first. Then decide how you want this to end, on your own terms, not his." I have thought about that phone call more times than I can count in the 14 months since, because it set the entire tone for everything that followed. Denise did not comfort me, not in the way people usually mean comfort. She did not tell me it would be okay. She did not tell me maybe there was an innocent explanation, because we both already knew, in the specific unspoken way, two women who trust each other completely can know something without saying it aloud, that there was no innocent explanation for $1,420 a month to an apartment complex for 12 consecutive months. What she gave me instead was a plan, the outline of one anyway, born from her own hard, expensive experience, and the name of a lawyer. The lawyer was Priscilla Vance, a family law attorney with an office above the hardware store on Cedar Falls Main Square, a woman in her late 50s with steel gray hair cut sharp at the jaw and a reputation, Denise told me, for being the single most methodical divorce attorney in 3 counties. The kind of lawyer who wins not through theatrics in a courtroom, but through the sheer overwhelming completeness of the paperwork she brings to the table. I made my first appointment with Priscilla using a name that wasn't quite a lie, Elaine W., using my maiden initial instead of Hargrove, paying the consultation fee in cash, scheduling it during my lunch break on a day I told the school office I had a dentist appointment. And I remember sitting in her small, book-lined office, hands folded in my lap, feeling like a woman playing a part in someone else's life and telling her everything I knew so far, which at that point was still just the credit card statement and the ring ritual I had only just started to understand differently. Priscilla listened without interrupting, the way I imagine she has listened to hundreds of women before me, and when I finished, she said something I have carried with me every day since. She said, "Elaine, I'm going to tell you the same thing I tell every client who comes in here in the first week of finding something like this out. The women who do well in this process, financially, emotionally, in every way that matters afterward, are almost never the ones who react the fastest. They're the ones who go quiet, who gather everything, who understand the full shape of what they're dealing with before they ever let the other party know they know anything at all. The women who do badly are the ones who confront in week 1. Out of pain, which I understand completely, pain wants to be spoken immediately. But pain that speaks too early loses leverage. It can never fully get back. If you can stand it, if you can genuinely stand it, I want you to go home tonight and keep living exactly the life you were living yesterday, and let me help you build a complete picture first. Then, when you're ready, you choose the moment, not him. You. I want to tell you honestly that I did not know, sitting in that office on that particular Tuesday, whether I could actually do what she was describing. 16 years of marriage. A genuine and, until that moment, genuinely happy one as far as I understood it, does not simply switch off into cold strategic patience because a lawyer suggests it would be wise. But I said yes. I said yes because some part of me, some part I am not entirely proud of and also not entirely ashamed of, recognized immediately that patience was not just the smart choice. It was going to become, over the following 14 months, the only thing that let me keep my own dignity intact while everything else in my understanding of my marriage quietly came apart. The name came 3 weeks later, and it came, again, almost entirely by accident, in a way that made me start to believe there was some strange justice in how carelessly deceit tends to leave its own fingerprints everywhere once you finally start looking for them. Marcus had a habit, one I had never thought twice about in 16 years, of leaving his laptop open on the kitchen counter overnight sometimes, logged into his work email because he often answered late client messages before bed and never bothered closing the lid all the way. I was not looking for anything specific that night, or at least that is what I told myself as I stood there in the dark kitchen at 11 at night with Maddie and Josh both long asleep upstairs. But I found myself scrolling, quietly, methodically, through a folder of old calendar invitations he had never bothered to delete, looking for anything that might have a name attached to Friday nights, to Birchwood Commons, to any pattern I could match against the credit card dates. I found it in a deleted items folder he had also never emptied, an 18-month-old email chain from a company called Castellan Consulting, a small firm that did logistics auditing work for companies like Brannigan Supply on a contract basis, and in that chain, buried in the middle of genuinely boring correspondence about warehouse throughput numbers, was a signature line. Renee Castellan, Principal Consultant. I sat with that name in the dark for a long time. Renee Castellan. I did not know her. I had never met her, never heard Marcus mention her at a company function, never seen her name on any calendar invite he'd ever shown me openly. But something about the tone of that email chain, 3 messages in, shifted from professional to something else. A joke about a client dinner that had run long, a comment from him that read, in my 9-year-old daughter's phrase, unnecessarily cute, given that they were supposedly still discussing warehouse throughput. I did not have proof yet, not real proof, not the kind Priscilla Vance would need, but I had, for the first time, a face to eventually put to the $1,420 a month and a name to search. I searched her online that same night, sitting at my kitchen table with the laptop angled so the blue light wouldn't wake anyone upstairs, and found a professional profile easily enough. Renee Castellan, 33 years old, according to a decade-old university graduation announcement I found archived in a local paper's digital records, an independent logistics and operations consultant who worked out of a shared office space 2 buildings down from Brannigan Supply's regional headquarters on Danforth Street, the kind of arrangement that would have put her in casual, plausible, easily explained proximity to my husband on a near-daily basis for at least the 18 months that email chain covered, likely longer. Her online presence was carefully, almost professionally curated, the kind of profile that gave away very little to a casual observer, though I was, by that point, no longer any kind of casual observer. I did not confront Marcus. I did not confront Renee Castellan. I did something that surprised even Denise when I told her about it the next day, something that felt, even as I was doing it, like watching myself from a slight distance, the way you watch yourself in a stress dream. I drove past Birchwood Commons on Elm Ridge Road on a Friday evening, 3 weeks after finding that email chain, parked 2 blocks away in the lot of a shuttered dry cleaner that had gone out of business the previous year, and waited, engine off, for 90 minutes, telling Josh and Maddie I had a parent-teacher conference that ran long, which was, technically, not entirely untrue, since I had in fact stopped by the school briefly beforehand to make the excuse plausible in case anyone happened to check. At 7:14 in the evening, I watched my husband's gray sedan pull into the Birchwood Commons parking lot, park in a numbered space near the back corner of the complex, and I watched him walk in his own familiar, unhurried gait. The gait I had watched cross 1,000 parking lots over 16 years, toward the entrance of Building 4, carrying a small paper grocery bag in one hand, the kind you carry when you've stopped to pick up something for dinner on the way somewhere. I watched him let himself in with a key, not a buzzer, not a call up to an intercom. A key from his own pocket, the specific, unhurried motion of a man who has let himself into that particular door hundreds of times before and no longer thinks about the motion at all. I sat in that dry cleaner parking lot with my hands on the steering wheel of a car I wasn't driving, in a lot 2 blocks from where my husband was, at that exact moment, walking into an apartment I now knew the exact address of, Unit 4C, Birchwood Commons, and I did not cry. I want to tell you honestly that surprised me more than almost anything else in this entire story, that after everything, sitting there with undeniable visual confirmation not 20 yards away, I did not cry even once. What I felt instead was something closer to a kind of grim, focused clarity. The sensation of a puzzle finally resolving into a picture you can actually see all at once, instead of in scattered pieces. I drove home that night, made it back before Josh's curfew requirements even applied to me, and when Marcus came home 4 hours later, smelling faintly of a cologne I did not recognize, a scent that was not the one I had bought him for Christmas 2 years running, I was already in bed with the lights off, and I said in a voice that came out steadier than I had any right to expect, "How was the Henderson account dinner?" And he said, "Honestly? Exhausting, but good. We might have the contract locked down by next quarter." And I said, "That's wonderful." And I meant in that moment only the second half of that sentence as a kind of private, silent commentary on exactly how wonderful it was that I now knew, beyond any reasonable doubt, precisely what kind of contract he had actually been locking down that evening. The following morning, I called Priscilla Vance's office and made a second appointment, and this time I brought her the address. Unit 4C, Birchwood Commons. A name, Renee Castellan. A pattern of dates matching 12, soon to be 13, months of credit card statements. Priscilla listened, took careful notes in a leather folio she kept for exactly this purpose, and then told me something that reframed the entire next year of my life. She said, "Elaine, what you have right now is enough to file for divorce on grounds of adultery in this state if you wanted to move today. But I don't think that's actually what you want yet, and I don't think it's what serves you best financially either, because right now everything Marcus has acquired or spent during this affair still technically sits inside a marriage where you have full legal access and full legal standing to document it. The moment you file, that access narrows considerably, and any assets he hasn't already dissipated become a great deal harder to trace and recover if he has any warning at all that you're coming. If you can stand to keep living inside this marriage a while longer, gathering everything, I can help you build a case so complete that when we do finally move, there will be no room for him to maneuver, no version of events he can spin, and no judge in this county who will see anything but a woman who behaved with extraordinary restraint, and a man who behaved with none at all. I asked her that day how long she thought that process might take, and she told me honestly that it depended entirely on how much I could stand to gather and how careful Marcus continued to be, or more usefully, how careless he continued to be, since men in the middle of an affair they believe is undiscovered tend to grow steadily less careful over time. Not more. A kind of creeping complacency that sets in once the initial fear of discovery fades and is replaced by a false sense of having gotten away with something. She was right about that in a way that would prove, over the coming months, almost eerily accurate. I want to describe what the next several months actually looked like from the inside, because I think this is the part of the story people find hardest to imagine, harder even than the discovery itself, which is the sheer ordinary texture of continuing to live, day after day, inside a marriage you already know is a performance on at least one side of it. I got up every morning at 6:15. I made coffee. I packed Josh's lunch, because even at 15 he still preferred mine to the cafeterias, and I packed Maddie's lunch, cutting her sandwich into the specific diagonal triangles she has insisted on since preschool. And I made Marcus's coffee exactly the way he likes it. Too much cream, barely any sugar, and I kissed him goodbye at the door most mornings the same way I had for 16 years. And some part of me, the part that still, even now, surprises me with its capacity for compartmentalization, genuinely enjoyed parts of those mornings, genuinely laughed at a joke Josh made about his chemistry teacher, genuinely felt the ordinary warm satisfaction of a house running smoothly, even while another part of me, running in parallel underneath all of it like a second current beneath a calm river surface, was cataloging, dating, photographing, and filing away every single piece of evidence that crossed my path. I kept a notebook, a plain black composition notebook I bought with cash at a drugstore 2 towns over that I hid inside a hollowed-out section of an old encyclopedia set in the garage, volumes nobody in this house had opened in a decade, and in that notebook I recorded dates. Every Friday Marcus said he had a client dinner running late. Every Friday, the credit card statement, which I now had electronic alerts routed quietly to a second email address Marcus didn't know existed, showed the same $1,420 charge landing on the first of the month. Every time he came home smelling of that unfamiliar cologne, a scent I eventually learned, through a receipt I photographed from his glove compartment on a night he'd left the car unlocked in the driveway, was called Hombre Nomade. Purchased at a department store 40 minutes away in a city he had no professional reason to be shopping in. Every time he mentioned the Henderson account or the Castellan consulting audit or any variation of a work explanation that, once you knew what to listen for, always seemed to cluster suspiciously around Friday evenings and the first week of the month, I befriended, carefully and without ever making it seem intentional, a woman named Priya Anand, who worked the front desk at Birchwood Commons on weekday evenings. Striking up a conversation with her one afternoon in the complex small attached coffee shop under the pretense of asking about availability and pricing for a niece who was supposedly relocating to Cedar Falls for a new job. Priya was talkative in the specific way people are when they spend long solitary shifts at a front desk and relish any excuse for genuine conversation. And over 3 or 4 separate visits, spaced out across 2 months so as never to seem like a pattern, I learned, without ever once asking a leading question that would have tipped my hand, that the tenant of record for Unit 4C was in fact a Ms. Renee Castellan, that she had lived there for just over 2 years, that she was, in Priya's words, always very put together, always very polite, and that she had, on more than one occasion that Priya had personally witnessed at the front desk, signed for packages addressed to a Marcus Hargrove, which Priya had simply assumed, reasonably, was a husband or a boyfriend. Since men's grocery deliveries and men's dry cleaning had started arriving at that unit with a regularity that a front desk attendant, over 2 years, inevitably starts to notice. I want to tell you about the day I actually went inside that building, because it is one of the moments I still think about most, still feel a small tremor of adrenaline remembering, even now. It happened on a Wednesday afternoon, a day I knew for certain Marcus was in a different county entirely, 40 minutes north, doing an actual legitimate territory visit I had confirmed through his shared work calendar, which I had, by that point, gained quiet access to under the guise of needing to coordinate a surprise party logistics conversation with his assistant, a sweet, entirely unsuspecting young woman named Katie who had no idea she was helping me build a legal case against her own boss. I walked into the lobby of Birchwood Commons in a blazer I don't normally wear, carrying a clipboard I'd bought specifically for the purpose, and told the different afternoon desk attendant, not Priya that day, that I was doing a routine inspection walkthrough for the property management company's insurance carrier, a lie so bald and so confident that it worked entirely on the strength of my own delivery, the specific, practiced calm I had spent 17 years developing in front of classrooms full of children who can smell uncertainty on an adult from 30 feet away. I did not go inside Unit 4C itself. I want to be honest about that because even in my most determined moments, I understood the legal risk of actual trespass into a residence. But I walked the 4th floor hallway. I noted the exact door, the small ceramic welcome mat outside it that read in small cursive lettering, "The Castellans," plural. A detail that made something in my throat close briefly before I forced it back open, and I photographed, discreetly, angling my phone from waist height without ever raising it to eye level, the hallway itself, the unit number. The mat documentation Priscilla Vance later told me was something close to genuine professional admiration, was more thorough than most private investigators managed to produce in twice the time. The plural welcome mat, "The Castellans," haunted me for days afterward in a way that surprised me, because it told me something I had not yet let myself fully consider, which was that whatever this arrangement was to Marcus, whatever careful private language he used in his own head to describe it to himself late at night, Renee Castellan herself appeared to be living inside some version of a domestic fantasy that included his last name on a doormat, a detail that suggested this had moved at some point in the last 2 years, from whatever it started as into something considerably more serious than what I imagine most straying husbands tell themselves they're doing. I brought this detail to Denise on our next phone call, and she was quiet for a long moment before she said, "Elaine, I think you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that this isn't just a fling that got out of hand. I think you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that somewhere in that apartment, this man has been quietly building a second marriage." She was, as it turned out, more right than either of us wanted her to be, though I would not have the full confirmation of exactly how right for another several months. I want to tell you about Josh and Maddie during this period, because I think it matters enormously, and because I have thought, more than once, about whether history will judge me for how normal I kept their daily lives while all of this moved underneath the floorboards of our house. Josh had a chemistry test that spring that he was anxious about for 2 solid weeks, and I sat with him at the kitchen table every night helping him with practice problems neither of us fully understood. And when he got his grade back, a solid B+, I made his favorite dinner to celebrate: chicken parmesan, the whole production, garlic bread and everything, and I remember Marcus coming home late that particular night, missing the celebration entirely, and I remember the specific private fury I felt watching Josh's face fall just slightly when his father's chair sat empty at the table, a fury that had nothing to do with the apartment on Elm Ridge Road directly, and everything to do with it at the same time, because I understood, with growing clarity every week that passed, that every Friday night Marcus spent in Unit 4C was a Friday night he was not spending watching his son grow up. And that particular theft, the theft of ordinary family evenings, felt in some ways heavier to carry than the betrayal of me specifically. Maddie, for her part, went through a brief phase that spring of asking me, apropos of nothing, whether Daddy still loved me, a question that stopped my heart cold the first time she asked it over a bowl of cereal on a random Tuesday morning, and I asked her, as calmly as I could manage, what made her ask that, and she shrugged in the particular elaborate way 11-year-olds shrug and said, "I don't know. He just seems like he's thinking about something else a lot." And I remember telling her, in a voice I am still, some days, faintly ashamed of for how convincingly calm it came out, that grown-ups sometimes get distracted by work, and that it didn't mean anything about how much he loved her or me, a sentence that was, I want to be clear, only half a lie, since I genuinely did not believe, and still do not believe, that whatever Marcus was doing on Elm Ridge Road had anything to do with how he felt about his own children. The summer brought the discovery that changed the entire shape of what I thought I was dealing with, and it came, like almost everything else in this story, through a small, careless mistake rather than any dramatic unmasking. Marcus had started, that June, leaving his phone face down on the kitchen counter while he showered in the mornings, a habit shift I noticed immediately, the way you notice any small deviation in a pattern you've been quietly studying for months. And one morning in late June, the phone buzzed with a text preview visible on the lock screen before it went dark again. Just 3 words followed by a heart emoji. "Can't wait Friday," from a contact saved simply as R. I did not touch the phone. I want to be honest that touching an unlocked device without consent carries its own legal complications that Priscilla had specifically warned me against. Evidence obtained that way can sometimes be challenged or excluded depending on how a judge views it, so I discipline myself every single time to only ever photograph what was already visible on a screen without unlocking anything further, a distinction that felt, some mornings, almost comically legalistic given the size of the betrayal it was meant to help prove. But it was a different discovery in early July that truly reframed everything. I was going through our joint safe deposit box at the bank, ostensibly to pull out Josh's birth certificate for a summer camp registration that required it. And in doing so, I noticed, tucked behind an accordion folder of old tax documents, a small velvet jewelry box I did not recognize, navy blue, the kind that comes from Halloran's, the one real jewelry store in downtown Cedar Falls. I opened it in the quiet, climate-controlled vault room, alone, my hands not quite steady, and found a ring inside. Not my ring. Not any ring I had ever seen. A slim gold band with a small cluster of sapphires, and tucked beneath the ring's velvet cushion, folded into a small square, a receipt. Halloran's fine jewelry, dated 3 weeks earlier. Item description: sapphire cluster band, size 6.5, paid in full, cash. I stood there in that vault room holding a ring that was not an engagement ring exactly, sapphires rather than a diamond, but was, unmistakably, a ring meant to be worn on a finger with real intention behind it. A ring my husband had paid cash for specifically. I understood immediately, so it would never appear on any card statement I might one day see. I called Priscilla from my car in the bank parking lot, hands actually shaking now for the first time in months, and read her the receipt over the phone, and she was quiet for a moment before she said in her careful, measured voice, "Elaine, I need you to listen to me very carefully. This changes the calculus somewhat, not the plan. The plan stays exactly the same. Patience, documentation, choosing your own moment. But I want you prepared for the possibility that whatever this relationship is to him, it may not be simply an affair in the traditional sense. Men who buy a woman a ring in a size that specific, paid in cash to avoid a paper trail, are very often men who have made some kind of promise, whether or not they intend, deep down, to ever actually leave their marriage to keep it. I want you prepared for the possibility that Renee Castellan believes she is going to become your husband's wife. I put the ring back exactly where I found it, in the exact fold of velvet, behind the exact folder of tax documents, and I drove home that afternoon and made dinner, spaghetti and meatballs, Josh's favorite, and when Marcus came home he complimented the meatballs specifically, said I'd outdone myself, and I said thank you, and smiled, and passed him the Parmesan, and underneath the entire ordinary domestic surface of that dinner, I was doing math in my head about exactly how much a size 6.5 sapphire cluster band costs at Halloran's, and exactly how many Friday nights, at $1,420 each, had funded the relationship that ring represented. I want to tell you about Carol, my sister-in-law, because she becomes important later in this story, and because I think it's worth explaining that not everyone in Marcus's family was in the dark the way I initially assumed they must be. Carol Hargrove Benn is Marcus's older sister by 3 years, a sharp, plain-spoken woman who works as a hospital administrator 2 towns over, married to a genuinely kind, unremarkable man named Phil, mother of 3 grown children, and someone I have always liked considerably more than the average sister-in-law horror story you hear from other women. Carol and I have never been especially close in the way some sisters-in-law become close, more like friendly allies at family gatherings. But that August, at a cookout at Carol and Phil's house, I noticed something in the way Carol watched her brother that made me wonder, for the first time, whether I was truly the last person in this extended family to understand what was happening. I caught Carol alone by the drink cooler that afternoon, ostensibly refilling my iced tea, and she said, without any preamble at all, in the specific blunt way Carol has always spoken, "Elaine, honey, is everything okay with you and Marcus?" And something in the careful, deliberate way she asked it. Not the vague way people usually ask that question at a family barbecue, but pointed, weighted, made me look at her directly and say, "Why do you ask, Carol?" And she held my gaze for a long moment and said quietly, "Because he's been different at Mom's Sunday dinners the last year or so. distracted, checking his phone under the table, and because I saw him in the parking lot of the mall in Fairview back in April with a woman I didn't recognize, standing closer than colleagues stand. And I've been sick about whether to say anything to you for 4 months now, and I decided today, watching you two together, that I couldn't keep sitting on it anymore, whether or not it's my place. I did not tell Carol everything that day. I want to be honest that I was still, even by August, protective of the case Priscilla and I were building, worried that even a sympathetic ally might inadvertently tip Marcus off through some innocent slip at a future family dinner. But I told her enough. The credit card, the apartment, the general shape of it, and Carol's face went through something I will never forget, a kind of controlled fury that reminded me, in that moment, exactly whose sister she actually was, because Marcus, underneath 16 years of the man I thought I knew, has always had that same capacity for a very controlled, very quiet kind of anger. And watching it surface in Carol's face instead of his was strangely disorienting. She said, "Elaine, whatever you're planning, whatever you need from me when the time comes, I am completely on your side, not his, and I need you to know that now, so you're not wondering later." That conversation with Carol mattered enormously to what happened months later, though I did not know it yet that August afternoon, standing by a cooler of melting ice with a woman who had just quietly become the first member of my husband's own family to choose me over him. September brought the closest I ever came in the entire 14 months to Marcus realizing that something in his careful arrangement had shifted. I had scheduled a third meeting with Priscilla Vance on a Thursday afternoon, using my planning period and then leaving school 20 minutes early with a story about a dentist appointment I was, by that point, faintly embarrassed to be reusing so often, and as I left Priscilla's office above the hardware store, folder of new documentation tucked into my tote bag beneath a stack of ungraded spelling tests, I nearly walked directly into Marcus himself, crossing the town square on his way to an actual legitimate meeting at the bank 2 doors down. My heart did something violent and immediate in my chest, a full-body lurch of pure adrenaline, and I did the only thing I could think to do in the half-second I had to react, which was smile, wave, and say, in a voice that came out far steadier than I had any right to expect, "Hey you, small world." And he smiled back, easy, unsuspecting, completely unbothered, said something about needing new checks printed for the business account, kissed me on the cheek right there on Main Street in front of God and everyone, and walked on toward the bank without a flicker of suspicion crossing his face. I sat in my car for 10 minutes afterward before I trusted myself to drive, hands genuinely shaking now, not from guilt. I want to be clear, I had done nothing that required guilt, but from the sheer physical toll of having come that close to an accidental collision between the two entirely separate lives I had been running in parallel for 6 months by that point. I called Denise from the parking lot and she talked me down the way she always did, steady and practical, reminding me that a near miss was not a discovery, that Marcus's easy, unbothered reaction was itself further proof of exactly how little he suspected, and that the closer I got to the end of this process, the more these near misses were simply the cost of doing the thorough, careful work that would eventually let me walk away with everything intact. By October, Priscilla and I had built what she called, with something close to professional pride, one of the most complete pre-filing evidence packages she had assembled in over 20 years of practice. 12, soon to be 14, months of matching credit card statements against a hand-kept log of Marcus's stated whereabouts on those same dates. Photographs of Unit 4C's hallway, the doormat, the parking lot, time-stamped across 4 separate months to establish an ongoing pattern rather than a single instance. The Halloran's receipt, which I had on a second visit to the safe deposit box in September, photographed in full for the first time, a detail Priscilla said would matter considerably if this ever became a question of dissipated marital assets, since cash withdrawals used to purchase gifts for a third-party can, in this state, sometimes be clawed back as part of an equitable distribution settlement if properly documented. A full accounting, going back 3 years, of every joint account, every individual account, every retirement fund, every piece of property, assembled not from anything hidden or stolen, but from statements I had every legal right, as his wife, to request and review. Priscilla had also, quietly, run what she called a basic asset search, standard practice before any filing, that turned up something neither of us had expected: a small used car loan taken out 18 months earlier in Marcus's name for a vehicle registered not to our household, but to an address on Elm Ridge Road, a compact silver hatchback that, once I thought about it, I realized I had seen parked in that same numbered space at Birchwood Commons on more than one of my earlier drive-bys, sitting beside his own gray sedan like a piece of a life I had never been told existed. I want to tell you honestly that by November I was tired in a way I don't think I can fully describe to anyone who hasn't lived through a prolonged, deliberate version of this. Not tired of the marriage exactly, because the marriage, as I had actually been living it day to day, the mornings, the packed lunches, the ordinary jokes at dinner, still felt in its surface texture like the life I had built and mostly still wanted. What I was tired of was the specific cognitive weight of holding two completely different realities in my head at once, every single hour of every single day. The reality Marcus believed we were both living in, and the reality I now knew, in exhaustive, notarized, photographed detail, we were actually living in. Denise told me, on a particularly hard phone call that November, that this exact exhaustion was the reason most women eventually break early and confront before they're fully ready. Not because they've lost their nerve exactly, but because the sheer maintenance cost of the double reality becomes, at some point, more painful than simply detonating it and dealing with the consequences immediately. I understood exactly what she meant. I also, somewhat to my own surprise, found that I did not want to break early, because somewhere in those months, without entirely deciding to, I had started to want something more specific than simply the truth coming out. I had started to want a particular kind of ending, one that happened on a night I chose, in a room I chose, in front of an audience I chose, because I had come to believe, the longer this went on, that Marcus deserved to lose control of the narrative in the exact same total, complete way he had spent 14 months believing he'd taken control of mine. That was when I started thinking seriously about our anniversary. Our 16th wedding anniversary fell in early February, and it had, for years, been a modest occasion in our house. Dinner out at a nice restaurant, sometimes a weekend away if the kids' schedules and our budgets both cooperated. Nothing especially elaborate. That November, I began telling Marcus, in casual conversation over several weeks, that I wanted to do something different for our 16th. A proper dinner at the house, both our families invited, his mother, Carol and Phil, my own sister and her husband, who lived 2 hours away, a genuine celebration rather than the two of us quietly splitting a bottle of wine at a restaurant booth. I told him I'd been feeling sentimental lately, that 16 years felt like a milestone worth actually marking properly in front of the people who loved us, and I watched his face as I said it, watched for any flicker of unease, any hesitation, and found none at all, only a warm, genuinely pleased smile and the words, "That sounds perfect, Elaine. Let's do it right." I want to be honest about how strange it felt, planning a celebration of our marriage as the actual mechanism of ending it, and I want to be equally honest that some part of me felt a discomfort bordering on guilt about using an anniversary, of all occasions, as the stage for what I intended to do. I brought this specific discomfort to Priscilla in what turned out to be one of our last strategy meetings before the night itself, and she said something that settled it for me completely. She said, "Elaine, you are not the one turning this anniversary into a lie. He has been doing that every single year for at least the last 2 of them, sitting across from you at that dinner, accepting your toast, while a woman across town wears a ring he paid cash for so you'd never see the receipt. You are simply choosing to let the truth arrive on the same night he's been quietly betraying, instead of some random Tuesday that means nothing to either of you. There is nothing dishonest about that. If anything, it's the most honest thing that's going to happen in that house on that particular date in years." I chose the guest list carefully over the following 2 months with a deliberateness that still, looking back, surprises me with its own cold precision. Marcus's mother, Dorothy, 71 years old, sharp as ever despite 2 hip replacements, a woman who had always treated me like a genuine daughter rather than an in-law. Carol and Phil, who I had, by December, brought fully into the loop, sitting at their kitchen table one evening in early December and laying out, for the first time, the complete case Priscilla and I had built. Watching Carol's jaw tighten progressively through every new piece of evidence until, by the time I reached the sapphire ring, she was gripping her own coffee mug hard enough that her knuckles had gone pale. My sister, Renata, and her husband Dale, who I told everything to as well, over a long, tearful phone call in early January, the first time in the entire 14 months that I actually cried while telling this story out loud, not from grief exactly, but from the sheer relief of finally saying all of it to someone who had known me my entire life. And, at Priscilla's specific suggestion, a business associate of Marcus's from Brannigan Supply, a plain-spoken, well-liked regional director named Harold Voss, who Marcus genuinely respected and who I invited under the entirely true premise of Harold and his wife having become good family friends over the years, a detail that would matter enormously for reasons I did not fully appreciate until the night itself, because Priscilla had explained carefully that having at least one witness present with professional standing in Marcus's own industry would make it considerably harder for him to later characterize the evening as some kind of orchestrated ambush among people who simply hated him personally, rather than what it actually was, a room full of people confronted, together, with the same documented truth. I did not invite Renee Castellan. I want to address that directly, because I know some people hearing this story will wonder why, if I wanted the fullest possible reckoning, I did not simply invite her as well and let both of them face the consequences in the same room on the same night. Priscilla advised firmly against it, on both legal and practical grounds, explaining that introducing a third party into what needed to remain, legally, a marital confrontation risked muddying the specific evidence trail we had built, and that Renee Castellan's reckoning, whatever it eventually looked like, was not mine to orchestrate. It was a consequence that would arrive on its own, through channels entirely separate from my marriage. Once the truth became public in the way I intended it to become public, I have thought about that decision many times since, and I still believe it was the right one, not out of any mercy toward Renee Castellan specifically, but because my 14 months of patience had never actually been about her. It had always, from the very first credit card statement, been about Marcus and about the specific, deliberate reckoning I intended him to face in a house full of people who loved him and had, every single one of them, been lied to right alongside me. January brought the final piece of the case, and it arrived, characteristically, through Marcus's own steadily increasing carelessness, exactly the pattern Priscilla had predicted back in that very first meeting nearly a year earlier. He had started by that point taking phone calls from Renee, whom he had saved in his phone under the deliberately bland contact name Regional Office, in the driveway rather than inside the house. A shift in behavior I noticed within the first week because I had, by then, spent 11 months noticing every single shift in his behavior with the trained attention of someone whose entire remaining marriage depended on it. I began carefully on nights he took these driveway calls, opening the kitchen window above the sink under the pretense of airing out whatever I was cooking, and standing at that sink with the water running just loud enough to explain my presence there, but not loud enough to actually obscure his voice outside. I heard, over 3 separate January evenings, fragments that confirmed everything Priscilla had warned me to prepare for back in July. I heard him say, on one particularly cold night, snow visible through the window collecting on the hood of his car, "I know, Ren, I know. I just need a little more time to figure out how to do this the right way. I don't want to blow up everything for the kids until I've got a real plan." And I heard, on a different night, something that landed harder than almost anything else in the entire 14 months, his voice dropping into a register I recognized, uncomfortably, as the exact tone he used to use with me in the first years of our own marriage, soft and low and genuinely tender, saying, "You know, none of this changes what I feel about you. I just need everyone to land on their feet when it finally happens. including Elaine. I'm not trying to be cruel to her. I just need time. I stood at that sink with the water running over my own hands, which had gone perfectly still, and felt something I had not expected to feel after 11 months of careful, documented patience, which was a very specific, very cold kind of vindication, because that single overheard sentence, "I'm not trying to be cruel to her," confirmed something I had needed confirmed for longer than I'd admitted even to myself. Marcus was not confused. Marcus was not caught in some fog of midlife weakness he didn't fully understand or couldn't fully control. Marcus knew, with complete clarity, exactly what he was doing to me, had apparently thought about it enough to construct his own internal narrative in which he was not cruel, merely slow, merely careful, merely waiting for the right configuration of circumstances to make his eventual betrayal land more gently. I told Priscilla about that overheard conversation the next morning, and she said quietly, "Elaine, I want you to hold on to exactly how that sentence made you feel, because in a few weeks, when this gets hard, and it will get hard, I want you to remember that the man in that driveway already knew precisely what he was doing to you, and had already decided, of his own free will, that his own timeline mattered more than your right to know." The final weeks of preparation moved with a strange, almost theatrical precision that still, looking back, feels faintly unreal to me, like remembering a play I directed rather than a life I actually lived. Priscilla drafted the actual divorce filing itself in advance, complete, ready, requiring only my signature and the final date to be entered, so that the moment the anniversary dinner concluded, whatever direction it went, I could have the papers formally filed and served within 48 hours, closing any window Marcus might otherwise have had to hide or move assets once he understood what was coming. I met with Priscilla one final time, the Tuesday before the dinner, and signed everything except the dateline, and she looked at me across her desk, folder closed between us, and said, "Elaine, I have done this with a great many women over 22 years of practice, and I want to tell you something I don't say often. You have built one of the cleanest, most complete cases I have ever assembled, and you did it while raising 2 children and teaching a full class of 9-year-olds, and never once, as far as I can tell, letting your husband suspect a single thing. Whatever happens Saturday night, I want you to know that you have already won the only part of this that was ever fully within your control, which is walking into that room knowing exactly who you are and exactly what actually happened, while he is about to walk into it still believing he's the only one holding the real story. I bought a new dress for the dinner, a deep emerald green, not because I particularly cared what I looked like that night in any vain sense, but because I had decided, somewhere in the final weeks of planning, that I wanted to walk into my own confrontation looking like a woman in complete control of herself, not a woman who had spent 14 months quietly falling apart, because the second version was, I had come to understand, precisely the story Marcus would try to tell if given half a chance, the wounded, hysterical wife who couldn't handle a little distance in a long marriage, and I intended to deny him that story before he ever got the chance to reach for it. I want to describe the Friday night immediately before the dinner, because it was, in its own way, one of the strangest nights of the entire 14 months. Marcus came home from what I now knew, with complete documented certainty, was Unit 4C, smelling faintly of ombre nomade, his wedding ring already back on his finger because I had watched him, over the preceding months, gradually abandon the Friday night ring ritual altogether now that he apparently felt secure enough in his own deception not to bother with the theater of it anymore, a detail that told me, more than almost anything else, exactly how completely he believed he had gotten away with all of it. He kissed me on the cheek, asked what time everyone was arriving tomorrow, said he was looking forward to it, said, and I remember this sentence with a clarity that still, months later, makes something in my stomach tighten. 16 years, Elaine, can you believe it? And I said, smiling genuinely, in a way that must have looked completely natural to him because he had no reason whatsoever to look for anything else in my face. No, I really can't. That night, after he fell asleep, I lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling of the bedroom we had shared for 11 of our 16 years of marriage, and I found myself thinking, unexpectedly, not about Renee Castellan, not even really about the apartment, or the ring, or the 14 months of careful documentation, but about the boy who had handed me his own jacket at a barbecue 18 years earlier, without a word of teasing, when I'd spilled potato salad down my shirt in front of 30 strangers. I thought about whether that boy had ever really existed the way I remembered him, or whether I had simply built him, over the years, out of a handful of genuinely kind moments strung together into a story I needed to believe about the life I'd chosen. I did not reach a conclusion that night. I'm not sure, honestly, that I have fully reached one even now. What I did reach, somewhere around 3 a.m, staring at the same ceiling, was a kind of settled calm, the specific calm of a woman who has done absolutely everything within her power to prepare for a single night and has nothing left to do now except live through it. Saturday arrived cold and clear, one of those bright, brittle February days where the sunlight looks warm through the window and turns out to be lying to you the moment you step outside. I spent the morning cooking, a full production. The same chicken parmesan Josh loved so much, stretched into a proper family-style version, a roast for those who preferred it, a salad, garlic bread, a cake I had ordered from the bakery on Fenwick Avenue 2 weeks earlier, white with a simple gold 16 written across the top in careful icing script. Marcus helped set up the folding table extension in the dining room that we only ever used for occasions exactly like this one, whistling under his breath, genuinely, visibly happy, and I want to be honest that watching him whistle while helping set the table for his own reckoning was one of the strangest sensations of the entire 14 months, a kind of vertigo that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with the sheer scale of what he still did not know. Everyone arrived within the same 20-minute window, the way families do for a dinner party, Dorothy first, 71, and sharp-eyed, kissing my cheek and telling me I looked beautiful. Then Carol and Phil, Carol catching my eye across the entryway with a look that carried the full weight of everything we'd discussed at her kitchen table 2 months earlier. Then Renata and Dale, driving in from 2 hours away, my sister squeezing my hand just slightly longer than a normal greeting requires, and finally Harold Voss and his wife Linda, Harold shaking Marcus's hand warmly, congratulating him on the account he'd apparently just closed that week, the two of them falling immediately into easy work conversation, while I moved through the kitchen finishing the last of the sides, aware every single second of the folder sitting inside my own tote bag in the front hall closet, thin, unremarkable looking, containing 16 years of a marriage reduced to 14 months of documented proof. We sat down to dinner around 6:30, 9 of us around the extended table, Josh and Maddie included, because I had decided, after long deliberation with both Priscilla and Denise, that excluding the children from the dinner itself while keeping them upstairs and unaware felt more disruptive and more frightening for them in the moment than including them. Seated, present, with the understanding, gently but clearly given to both of them the night before by me alone, that tonight Mommy was going to say some difficult things about Daddy, and that whatever happened, both of them were loved completely, and were not, in any way, the reason for any of it. Josh had been quiet and serious when I told him, the way he gets, and had simply nodded and said, "Okay, Mom," and Maddie had cried a little and then asked, "Is this about him seeming distracted all the time?" And I had held her and said, "Yes, sweetheart, exactly that." And she had nodded like something in her had already, quietly on her own, begun preparing for this night without either of us saying so directly. Dinner proceeded, for the first 45 minutes, exactly like any ordinary family celebration, Dorothy telling a long story about Marcus as a boy, losing a Little League game so badly he cried in the dugout. Harold and Marcus trading easy jokes about a difficult client, Josh and Maddie giggling together over something on Maddie's phone under the table that I chose not to police that particular night. I ate very little. I drank exactly 1 glass of wine, deliberately, wanting my head completely clear for what was coming. Around 7:15, as Carol began clearing the first round of plates, a task she had, I now understand, deliberately volunteered for so she could catch my eye on her way to the kitchen, I stood up from the table myself, tapped my water glass gently with a spoon, and said, in a voice that came out steadier than I had privately worried it might, "I'd like to say a few words, if that's all right, before we bring out the cake." The table quieted the way tables do for a toast, everyone turning toward me with warm, expectant faces, Marcus included, reaching for his own wine glass with an easy smile, clearly anticipating the kind of sentimental 16-year toast every person at that table had heard a version of before at some other family occasion. I want to describe what I actually felt in that specific moment. Glass in hand, every face in the room turned toward me, because it was not fear, and it was not even really nervousness anymore. 14 months of preparation had burned all of that away somewhere along the line. What I felt was something closer to a strange, focused stillness, the same stillness I imagine a diver feels standing at the very edge of a high platform after having already climbed every single stair. I said, 16 years ago, I married a man who handed me his own jacket at a barbecue because I'd spilled potato salad down my shirt in front of everyone we knew, and I have told that story so many times over the years that I think some of you could probably tell it better than I can at this point. I looked, deliberately, around the table, at Dorothy, at Carol, at Harold, at my own sister, before I let my eyes finally settle on Marcus, who was still smiling, still holding his wine glass, still utterly unaware that the ground beneath his chair had already, in every meaningful sense, ceased to exist. I said, "I want to tell you all a different story tonight. I want to tell you about a Tuesday in March, 14 months ago, when a credit card statement arrived at our house that wasn't supposed to come to our house at all, and what I found on it." I watched Marcus's face change in real time, watched the easy warmth drain out of it in the space of about 2 seconds, replaced first by confusion, then, as I kept speaking, by something considerably more like dawning horror. I said $1,420 a month every month for over a year to Birchwood Commons Property Management for Unit 4C on Elm Ridge Road. I said a doormat outside that unit that says, in small cursive letters, the Castellans. I said a sapphire cluster ring, size 6.5, purchased in cash at Halloran's so it would never appear on any statement I might see. I said a silver hatchback registered to that same address, financed in your name, that I have personally watched parked in that lot more times than I can count anymore. I said each detail slowly, clearly, without raising my voice even once, watching Marcus's face go through a transformation I will genuinely never forget as long as I live, the specific collapse of a man watching, in real time, every single brick of a carefully maintained lie fall away at once, in front of his mother, his sister, his colleague, his children, and the woman he had apparently believed, right up until that exact second, understood absolutely nothing about any of it. Dorothy's hand went to her own mouth. Carol did not react with surprise at all, which Marcus clearly clocked immediately, his eyes flicking to his sister's carefully composed face and understanding, in that instant, that Carol had already known, had already chosen a side, months before this dinner had even been planned. Harold set his wine glass down very carefully, very deliberately, the exact motion of a man realizing he has just become an unintended witness to something considerably larger than a family disagreement. Josh's face had gone pale and still in the way his father's does under pressure, and Maddie had reached, without seeming to think about it at all, for her brother's hand under the table. Marcus said, "Elaine," and then stopped and said it again, "Elaine," and I watched him search, visibly, for some version of denial that might still work in a room where I had just recited an exact address, an exact unit number, an exact dollar figure, an exact receipt, and finding, I think for the first time in 14 months, that there was genuinely nothing left to reach for. He said finally, quietly, "How long have you known?" And I said, 14 months, Marcus. 14 months exactly. as of this week, which happens to be roughly how long you've been taking your ring off on Friday nights and telling me your fingers swell." The room was completely silent for a long moment, the specific silence of 8 other people watching a marriage end in real time. And then Marcus said the thing I had, honestly, expected him to say from the very beginning, because I have known this man for 18 years and understood, better than almost anyone in that room, exactly which direction his instincts run under pressure. He said, "Why didn't you say something sooner? Why would you let this go on for 14 months, sit across from me at dinner, sleep in the same bed, if you knew?" And I felt something in me go very cold and very clear, because I understood immediately that he was already, in his very first sentence, trying to shift some portion of the weight of what he had done onto the manner in which I had chosen to discover and reveal it, and I was not going to allow that redirection to stand for even one moment. I said, "Marcus, I let this go on for 14 months because I wanted to understand exactly what I was dealing with before I ever gave you the chance to spin it, hide it, or minimize it, the way you are already, right now, in this exact sentence, trying to make this about my methods instead of your 14 months of lying to me, to your children, to your own mother, in this very house." I said, "I have a folder in the front hall closet with dated photographs, financial records, and receipts covering every single one of those 14 months, prepared with a family law attorney who has already drafted the divorce filing, which will be served to you formally within 48 hours. I said, "I did not do this out of cruelty, and I did not do this to humiliate you in front of your mother, though I understand that is exactly how it feels to you right now. I did this because I wanted every single person at this table, everyone who loves you and was also, every one of them, lied to right alongside me, to hear the truth in the same room, on the same night, so that there would never be a version of this story you could tell any of them afterward that didn't include every single fact I have just laid on this table." Dorothy was crying by then, quietly, and she said, "Marcus, is this true?" in a voice that had gone smaller and older than I had ever heard it. And Marcus, who had been sitting frozen for the better part of a minute, finally looked at his own mother and said quietly, "Yes." And I watched something in Dorothy's face break in a way I still, months later, feel a genuine ache remembering, because whatever else was true that night, she was a 71-year-old woman learning in front of her entire family that her son was not who she had believed him to be. Carol stood up then, and I want to describe exactly what she did, because it mattered enormously to me in that moment and matters to me still. She walked around the table, past her own brother's chair, and stood directly behind mine, placing both hands on my shoulders and said to the entire table, but really to Marcus, "I've known for months. I saw you in Fairview in April with her. I told Elaine in August because I couldn't keep watching her sit across from you, not knowing what I already suspected. And I want everyone at this table to understand that I am not choosing my brother tonight. I am choosing the truth, and the truth is, sitting in this chair, and I am standing behind her." Harold, for his part, said very little, but what he did say mattered in its own way. He stood quietly, helped Linda with her coat, and before he left, he shook my hand, not Marcus's, and said, "Elaine, I'm sorry you had to do this tonight, of all nights, and I want you to know I'll be having a very different conversation with Marcus on Monday about how this affects certain conversations at the office, a comment whose full weight I would not understand until several weeks later, when it became clear that Harold, a regional director with considerable influence over territory assignments, was not going to simply pretend Saturday night hadn't happened once the work week resumed. Marcus tried for a while longer, every angle I imagine a cornered man reaches for in that situation. He said it wasn't what it looked like. Then, faced with the specific weight of the documentation, seemed to abandon that line entirely. He said he'd been planning to end it, that he'd been trying to find the right time, and I thought immediately of the overheard driveway conversation from January. "I just need a little more time to figure out how to do this the right way," and said out loud in front of everyone, "I know exactly what you were planning, Marcus, because I heard you say it myself, standing in our own driveway telling her none of this changes what I feel about you. I just need everyone to land on their feet, including Elaine. I said, I am not a logistics problem you were slowly working through on your own timeline. I am your wife. I said that word, wife, with a weight I felt in my own chest as I said it, because it was, I understood even as I spoke, likely the last time I would ever say it about myself in relation to him, and I wanted it to land exactly as heavily as it deserved to. Josh spoke only once, near the end, in a voice much quieter than his usual, and he said, Dad, did you know about my chemistry test? And Marcus, thrown by the sudden shift, said, What? And Josh said, The one in the spring, I was so worried about it, and you weren't even here when I got my grade back, because you were with her, weren't you? And Marcus did not answer that question at all, and the silence where his answer should have been told Josh and everyone else at that table everything he needed to know. Maddie cried quietly into her brother's shoulder, and I went to both of my children before I did anything else, kneeling between their chairs, and told them, in the calmest voice I had left after everything I had just said, that none of this was their fault, that they were loved completely by me and would continue to be loved completely no matter what happened next between their father and me, and that being brave enough to sit through a hard truth being told out loud was one of the most difficult things a person can do, and that I was proud of both of them for doing it. Marcus left the house around 9 that night, not asked to leave exactly, though the request was, by that point, thoroughly implied by every single person remaining in the room, and I remember watching him go, taking a small overnight bag from the front closet, and I felt in that specific moment watching 16 years walk out my own front door, not triumph and not quite grief either, but something closer to a very tired, very complete kind of relief, the relief of a woman who has been holding an enormous weight in exactly the same position for 14 months, finally allowed to set it down. The days immediately following the dinner moved fast, faster than I expected, though I suppose 14 months of preparation had ensured exactly that outcome. Priscilla filed the divorce petition the following Monday morning, and Marcus was formally served that same Wednesday at his office by a process server Priscilla had specifically arranged to arrive during business hours, a choice she explained to me plainly, not out of any particular vindictiveness, but because serving him at the office rather than quietly at some more private moment ensured there would be a clear, witness timestamp on the record establishing exactly when formal proceedings began, closing off any possibility of him claiming later that assets had moved before he was properly notified. I did feel a small twist of something uncomfortable when she told me the location, some old habit of not wanting to embarrass him professionally, and I sat with that discomfort for a moment before recognizing it, with a kind of wry, exhausted clarity, as the exact same instinct that had kept me quiet in that kitchen 14 months earlier instead of confronting him immediately, and I let Priscilla proceed exactly as planned. Marcus called me 11 times that first week and texted considerably more, and I want to be honest that the content of those messages moved through almost exactly the stages Priscilla had warned me to expect from a client's spouse in this situation. First, anger. Several messages accusing me of humiliating him deliberately in front of his mother and his colleague, of turning his own children against him, of being cold and calculating and cruel. Then, within days, a shift toward a kind of desperate bargaining, messages asking for one conversation, just one, insisting that whatever I thought I understood about his relationship with Renee Castellan was more complicated than it looked, that he had been planning to end things with her for months, that the ring was, and this is a direct quote I still, months later, find almost unbelievable in its own delusional creativity, not what I thought it was. I did not respond to any of these messages directly. I forwarded every single one to Priscilla, who kept them as part of an ongoing record, and I let my silence do the work that 14 months of careful documentation had already done far more completely than any argument I could have made over text. I found out, about 2 weeks after the dinner, through Carol, who had it from their mother Dorothy, who had apparently called Marcus directly and demanded to know the full truth in a conversation. Carol described to me as the single most difficult phone call she had ever overheard secondhand, that Marcus's relationship with Renee Castellan had, in fact, been going on for just over 2 years. Not the 14 months my documentation directly covered, but closer to 26, beginning several months before that very first credit card charge I had discovered, during an earlier period when he had apparently paid for things in cash before eventually growing comfortable enough, complacent enough, to start using the secondary card. I sat with that revised timeline for a long time after Carol told me, doing my own quiet math, realizing that Josh's 8th grade graduation, an evening I remembered as genuinely happy, Marcus filming the whole ceremony on his phone, had fallen inside that expanded window, and something about that specific realization, more than almost anything else in the entire unraveling, made me sit down hard on the edge of my own bed and cry for the first time in months. Not for the marriage exactly, but for the specific retroactive theft of a memory I had believed, right up until that moment, was entirely what it appeared to be. Denise came over that same night without my even calling her, because Carol had apparently, with a thoughtfulness I will never forget, texted her directly to say I might need someone, and Denise sat with me at my own kitchen table until nearly midnight, not saying very much, mostly just present, refilling my tea. And at one point she said the thing I needed to hear most in that particular moment, which was, "Elaine, the 8th grade graduation was still real. Your love for your son in that moment was real. His father's absence from that love, even while standing right there filming it, does not undo what you actually felt watching your boy walk across that stage. You don't have to let him steal that memory too." I have held on to that sentence since almost as tightly as I held on to anything Priscilla ever told me in her office. The divorce proceedings themselves took a little over 4 months from filing to final decree, faster than Priscilla had originally estimated, and she told me plainly that the speed was almost entirely a function of the completeness of the case we had built during those 14 months of quiet preparation. Marcus's own attorney, a younger man from a firm 2 towns over who I never once met in person, apparently advised him early on that contesting the adultery grounds or the financial dissipation claim tied to the cash withdrawals and the sapphire ring was not a fight worth having given the sheer volume of dated, time-stamped, independently corroborated documentation Priscilla presented at the very first settlement conference. A folder Priscilla told me later she had specifically organized in chronological order with tab dividers, precisely so that opposing counsel would understand within the first 10 minutes of reviewing it that this was not a case they wanted to take in front of a judge. The settlement that resulted reflected that reality. I kept the house on Larkspur Lane outright, an asset Priscilla had specifically prioritized, given that uprooting Josh and Maddie in the middle of everything else happening in their lives felt to both of us like an unnecessary, additional wound. I received a considerably larger share of the joint retirement accounts than a 50-50 split would have produced, based on the documented dissipation of marital assets toward the Birchwood Commons apartment and the Halloran's purchases. Money, Priscilla successfully argued, should be effectively clawed back and credited to my side of the ledger, rather than treated as neutral joint spending. Child support and a defined alimony period were set based on Marcus's actual income at Brannigan Supply, income that, as it turned out, was about to change in ways neither of us had fully anticipated on the night of that dinner. Harold Voss's comment on his way out that Saturday night, that he'd be having a very different conversation with Marcus about certain things at the office, turned out to carry more weight than I initially understood. I learned months later through Carol, who still maintained a careful, complicated relationship with her brother even after everything, that Brannigan Supply's regional leadership, Harold included, had grown increasingly uncomfortable over the preceding 2 years with what several colleagues had apparently already quietly noticed as Marcus's habit of scheduling territory visits with suspiciously convenient overlap near Danforth Street, where Castellan Consulting kept its offices, a pattern that had never technically violated any written company policy, but had, evidently, generated exactly the kind of workplace whispers that eventually reach a regional director's ears, whether he wants them to or not. Whatever conversations happened internally at Brannigan Supply that spring, the outcome was that Marcus was quietly moved off his existing 4-county territory within 3 months of the dinner, reassigned to a considerably smaller, less lucrative region, a demotion in every practical sense, though never officially labeled as one. And I understood, hearing this secondhand, that the consequences of those 14 months had begun radiating outward into parts of his life that had nothing directly to do with me at all. I learned less, and frankly wanted to know less, about what happened to Renee Castellan specifically, though a few details reached me anyway, the way details always seem to in a town the size of Cedar Falls. Her consulting contract with Brannigan Supply was quietly not renewed that same spring. Whether through her own choice or the company's, I never fully confirmed and did not particularly care to investigate. I heard, through the same second-hand channel of Carol and Dorothy's occasional careful conversations, that the relationship between her and Marcus did not survive the divorce process intact, that whatever had sustained itself in the protected, private space of Unit 4C for over 2 years did not apparently translate cleanly into the daylight of an actual public relationship once the affair stopped being a secret and started being simply a fact people in town already knew and quietly judged. I want to be honest that I felt, hearing this, considerably less satisfaction than I might have expected 14 months earlier, sitting in that dry cleaner parking lot, watching Marcus walk into that building with a grocery bag in his hand. By the time the divorce was final, I had largely moved past needing Renee Castellan's own unhappiness to feel resolved about mine, which surprised me, and which Denise told me, when I mentioned it to her, was probably the single clearest sign that I actually had healed as much as I believed I had. I want to tell you about the specific texture of those 4 months for Josh and Maddie, because it mattered more to me than almost anything else happening in the legal proceedings running in parallel. Josh, true to his quiet, serious nature, processed most of it internally at first, and I worried for a few weeks that he was simply burying it the way 15-year-old boys sometimes learn to bury things, until one evening in March he came down to the kitchen while I was grading papers and said, without much preamble, "Mom, I looked stuff up online about how kids are supposed to feel about this kind of thing." And I said, "Okay, and what did you find?" And he said, "Mostly that it's supposed to be my dad's fault and not yours. And I wanted you to know I actually believe that. I'm not just saying it because I think you want to hear it." I remember setting down my red pen and simply holding my son for a long moment, because that specific sentence, unprompted, researched, offered without any performance behind it, told me more about how he was actually doing than any therapist's assessment could have. Maddie's grief was louder, messier, and in some ways easier to tend to precisely because she let it be visible. She had a hard several weeks that spring, a dip in her grades that her teacher, a kind woman named Ms. Reyes, who I knew professionally through school events, flagged gently and privately, and I sat with Maddie many nights that spring while she cried about missing her dad, missing the version of him that had existed before any of this, a version I understood, with a complicated mixture of grief and clarity, had probably never fully existed the way either of us wanted to remember it. But that did not make her missing it any less real or any less worth honoring. I made a point throughout that entire process of never once speaking badly of Marcus directly to either child, a discipline Priscilla herself had recommended strongly, not for his sake, but because children carry the weight of a parent's bitterness in ways that damage them far more than it damages the parent being criticized. And I wanted my children to be able to construct their own honest relationship with their father, at whatever distance and whatever pace felt right to them, without my own anger standing permanently in the way of it. Cedar Falls, being the kind of town it is, found out within about 2 weeks, the way small towns always eventually find out everything, though I want to be honest that the specific channel surprised me. It was not, as I had half expected, Dorothy or Carol or anyone directly connected to the family who let it slip. It was Harold Voss's wife, Linda, who mentioned it entirely without malice to another woman at a hair salon on Fenwick Avenue, who mentioned it to someone else, and within roughly 3 weeks, the broad outline of what had happened at that anniversary dinner had made its way through enough of Cedar Falls that I began noticing it in small ways. A slightly too careful sympathy from a fellow teacher in the faculty lounge, a neighbor 2 doors down bringing over a casserole with the specific overly gentle demeanor people reserve for someone recently widowed or recently divorced, a parent at school pickup who I barely knew squeezing my arm and saying simply, "Good for you, Elaine," in a tone that told me she knew considerably more of the story than I had ever told her directly. I want to be honest that this public exposure was, for the first month or so, one of the harder parts of the entire process. Harder in some ways than the private pain of the marriage ending itself, because there is a particular kind of vulnerability in having your most private humiliation become a piece of casual conversation at other people's dinner tables, discussed by people who will never fully understand the 14 months of careful, exhausting work that preceded the single dramatic night they've all heard about secondhand. But I found as the weeks passed that the town's overwhelming reaction was not the pitying, reductive one I had initially feared. Ferris, the older gentleman who ran the hardware store below Priscilla's office and had, I later learned, seen me coming and going from her office for the better part of a year without ever once mentioning it to a single soul, stopped me on Main Street one afternoon in April and said simply, "Mrs. Hargrove, I want you to know I've kept my mouth shut about all those visits to the lawyer's office upstairs. Figured it wasn't my business until you made it your business. And I just want to say, for what it's worth, that took a hell of a lot more patience than most people have in them." I remember thanking him and walking to my car with tears in my eyes that had nothing to do with sadness at all. Josh's chemistry teacher, coincidentally the same one whose test had caused him so much anxiety the previous spring, mentioned to me at a parent conference that spring, apparently having heard some version of the story through the school's own informal grapevine, that Josh had become noticeably more focused and engaged in class that semester, and I remember thinking, with a complicated mixture of pride and grief, that my son seemed to be channeling something difficult into discipline in exactly the way I recognized from my own 14 months of careful documentation, a coping mechanism I was not entirely sure I wanted to have passed down to him, even as I understood, watching him bring home a solid A that semester, that it was serving him well in its own way. Marcus, for his part, made real efforts that spring and summer to rebuild something with Josh and Maddie, efforts I want to be fair about describing honestly, because I do not think it serves anyone, least of all my own children, for me to pretend their father made no genuine attempt at all. He kept his scheduled visitation faithfully, almost without exception, showed up on time, engaged, present in a way that suggested at least some part of him understood exactly how much he had already cost them, and was determined not to compound it with additional absence. Josh remained guarded with him for a long time, polite but careful. The specific careful of a boy who has learned, at 15, that a parent's steadiness cannot always be assumed the way it once could. Maddie, being younger and, in her own words, more willing to give people second chances than her brother, warmed back toward her father somewhat faster, though even she, by that summer, had developed a habit of watching him a little more closely than she used to, checking in small unconscious ways whether his attention was actually with her or somewhere else entirely, a habit I noticed, with an ache I don't think will ever fully disappear, because it told me that some piece of what those 14 months had cost my children was not simply the loss of an intact family, but the loss of a certain uncomplicated trust in adults generally. A loss no custody arrangement or child support payment could ever fully repair. I want to tell you about my own process that spring and summer, because I think it matters as much as anything else in this story, and because I suspect some people listening to this have wondered, somewhere along the way, whether 14 months of cold, methodical documentation left me capable of actually grieving the marriage at all, or whether I had simply skipped straight to strategy and never properly felt any of it. I want to be honest that the grief arrived in full, but it arrived late, and out of order, in a way that surprised even Denise, who has walked several friends through divorces by that point and told me she'd never quite seen the sequence play out the way it played out in me. I did not cry the night of the dinner. I did not cry, particularly through the filing, the serving, the settlement conferences. What I did, instead, was function, competently, almost eerily so, through every single practical step of dismantling 16 years of a shared life. And then, roughly 5 months after the dinner, on an entirely unremarkable Tuesday afternoon in July, sorting through a box of old photographs to divide up copies for the kids, I found a picture of Marcus holding Josh as a newborn, exhausted and radiantly happy, in a way I remember being entirely real in that specific moment. Whatever came later, and I sat down on my own bedroom floor and cried for almost 2 hours, the delayed, complete grief of everything I had postponed feeling while I was too busy surviving it. Denise came over again that day too, the way she had all year, and sat with me on that same bedroom floor and said something I think about often now. She said, "Elaine, you didn't get to grieve on schedule because you were too busy protecting your kids and your future self from a man who would have used your grief against you if you'd shown it too early. That's not a flaw in how you handled this. That's the actual cost of having to handle it the way you did, and I think you're allowed to grieve that cost too. Not just the marriage itself, but the fact that you never really got to fall apart in the moment the way people are supposed to be allowed to." That summer, once the final decree came through in late June, I did something I had not allowed myself to seriously consider during the entire 14 months of preparation, or the 4 months of proceedings that followed, which was think, honestly, about what I actually wanted the next chapter of my own life to look like, separate entirely from the identity of wronged wife, careful documentarian, or single mother managing 2 grieving children, all roles I had inhabited so completely over the preceding year and a half that I had, at some point, nearly forgotten there was a woman underneath all of them who had her own separate wants. I repainted the bedroom that had been ours for 11 years, a soft, warm gray to replace the pale blue Marcus had chosen years earlier, a small gesture that felt, the day I finished the last coat, disproportionately significant, like reclaiming a room that had, for 14 months, felt less like my own space and more like the stage set for a performance I was quietly rehearsing every single night. I took up running again, something I had loved in my 20s and let quietly lapse somewhere in the busy middle years of marriage and small children, starting with slow, awkward half-mile loops around the block that left me winded and a little proud, building, by August, to actual 3-mile routes along the river path that runs behind the elementary school, routes I ran most mornings before the kids woke up, finding in the rhythm of it a kind of clarity I had not expected to need so specifically, but came to depend on completely. I want to tell you about a conversation I had with Maddie that August, because it is one of the moments from that first summer I hold on to most tightly. We were sitting on the back porch one evening, the 2 of us, Josh off at a friend's house, and Maddie asked me, out of nowhere, the way 11-year-olds do, "Mom, are you happy now?" And I thought about the question seriously before I answered it, because I did not want to give her a reflexive, comforting lie. And I said, "Honestly, I'm happier than I expected to be this soon. And some days I'm still sad, and I think both of those things are going to keep being true for a while. And that's okay." And she nodded, considering this with the particular gravity she brings to most things, and said, "I think I'm like that too." And then, after a pause, added, "I'm glad you told everyone at the dinner, instead of just telling us quietly some other day, because I would have always wondered if there was more you weren't saying, and this way I know you told us everything." And I remember sitting with that observation for a long time after she went inside, struck by how completely my 11-year-old daughter had understood something about the value of total public clarity that had taken me 14 months of careful strategy to arrive at myself. I want to also be honest about the parts of that first year that were not triumphant, because I think stories like this one sometimes get flattened in the retelling into a simple, satisfying arc of betrayal and vindication, when the actual lived experience of it was considerably messier than that. There were nights that fall. The first fall after the divorce was final, when the house felt unbearably quiet after the kids went to bed, when I caught myself reaching for my phone to tell Marcus something about Josh's day out of 16 years of pure habit, before remembering, with a small, fresh jolt of loss, that he was not the person I told things like that to anymore. There were moments at school functions, a fall parent-teacher conference night, a winter concert, where I stood alone among couples and felt a specific, sharp loneliness that had nothing to do with regretting the divorce itself and everything to do with simply missing the architecture of partnership, even a partnership that had turned out to be, for at least 2 of its final years, fundamentally dishonest. I want anyone listening to this who has gone through something similar to know that those 2 things, relief at having left a lie and grief at having lost a partnership, are not contradictions. They coexisted in me for a long time, and to some smaller degree, they still do. Priscilla Vance, whom I still see occasionally, since Cedar Falls is small enough that running into your own divorce attorney at the grocery store is simply a fact of life, told me once, almost a year after the dinner, that she had thought about my case more than most in her 22 years of practice, not because the underlying facts were unusual. Infidelity cases, she told me plainly, are unfortunately not rare, but because of the specific discipline I had shown in the preparation, the 14 months of choosing patience over the immediate, understandable urge to confront. She said, "Elaine, most people think of what you did as revenge, and I understand why, but I've never actually thought of it that way. I think of it as the most complete act of self-respect I've watched a client execute in this entire career, because you didn't just want him to know that you knew. You wanted the full truth, undiluted, unspinnable, delivered on your own terms, in your own time, to an audience that would actually hold him accountable to it. That's not revenge. That's simply refusing to let someone else's lie be the last word on your own life." Marcus attempted, twice over the course of that first year, to reopen the question of reconciliation, and I want to describe both attempts honestly, because I think how I handled each of them says something important about what 14 months of careful patience had actually taught me about myself. The first attempt came about 5 months after the divorce was final in the early winter, when he showed up unannounced at the house one Saturday afternoon while the kids were at Carol's for the day, and asked, standing on my own front porch in the cold, whether I would consider having coffee with him, just to talk. No pressure, no expectations, and I remember standing in that doorway, genuinely considering it for a moment, not out of any lingering romantic hope, but out of a kind of practical curiosity about what he might actually say, given more time and distance from the raw wound of that dinner. I agreed, cautiously, to one coffee at a neutral cafe 2 towns over rather than anywhere in Cedar Falls itself, a boundary I set deliberately, and he accepted without argument. That coffee, which lasted just under an hour, told me most of what I needed to know about whether reconciliation was ever a realistic possibility. Marcus spent the majority of it explaining, in careful, rehearsed-sounding language, the specific pressures that had led him to Renee Castellan in the first place, a narrative that centered heavily on feeling unappreciated, on the slow erosion of romance in a marriage consumed by children and mortgages and the daily grind of ordinary life, a narrative that was not, I want to be fair, entirely without some grain of truth in it, because every long marriage experiences some version of that erosion. But what struck me, sitting across that small cafe table, was how little of his explanation actually grappled with the specific choices he had made, the cash withdrawals, the ring, the 2 years of increasingly comfortable deception, the driveway phone calls where he described his own timeline for eventually, someday, getting around to telling me the truth. He spoke as though the affair itself was something that had happened to him, a weather pattern he'd been caught in, rather than a sustained, deliberate architecture he had built and maintained, brick by careful brick, for over 2 years. I told him, as gently and as honestly as I could manage, that I did not think we were talking about the same event, that he seemed to be describing a man who drifted, and I had spent 14 months documenting a man who planned, and that the distance between those 2 descriptions was, in my estimation, exactly the distance neither of us was going to be able to close, no matter how many coffees we had. He asked, near the end of that hour, whether there was truly nothing that could change my mind. And I told him, honestly, that I did not think it was really about my mind changing at all anymore. I told him that somewhere in those 14 months, I had stopped being a woman waiting to see whether her marriage could be saved, and had become, instead, a woman building a life that did not depend on his choices at all, and that the version of me who might have once been willing to fight to save what we had no longer existed, not out of bitterness, but simply because 14 months of careful, quiet self-reliance had built someone new in her place. Someone I found, to my own genuine surprise, that I liked considerably more. The second attempt came closer to the 1-year mark, this time a longer letter rather than an in-person request, several handwritten pages that Carol delivered to me personally rather than let arrive by mail, having read it herself first with Marcus's permission, and having told me beforehand, with her usual bluntness, that she thought it was the most honest thing she had ever heard her brother say about himself, though she was careful to add that honest did not necessarily mean sufficient. The letter was, I want to acknowledge, fairly considerably more self-aware than the coffee conversation had been, an actual accounting of specific failures rather than a general narrative of drift, an acknowledgement, in his own handwriting, of the driveway phone calls, of the deliberate cash purchases designed to avoid my discovery, of the specific cruelty of allowing Josh to believe his father's absence from that chemistry test celebration was simply about work. I read that letter twice, sitting alone at my kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon, and I felt reading it something considerably softer than I expected to feel, a kind of sad, complicated compassion for the version of Marcus who had apparently spent the better part of a year doing his own quiet reckoning, in parallel to mine, arriving late at an honesty he had denied me for 2 years. But compassion, I discovered that afternoon, is not the same thing as a desire to rebuild. And I wrote him back, briefly, thanking him for the honesty in the letter, telling him that I believed it was genuine, and telling him, as clearly as I knew how, that genuine remorse arriving a year after the fact does not erase the 2 years that preceded it, and that I had built, in that year, a life and a version of myself I was not willing to set back down in exchange for the possibility of a marriage, rebuilt, on the far side of that particular kind of betrayal. I told him, and I meant this as kindly as it is possible to mean it, that I hoped he continued doing the work reflected in that letter, for his own sake and for the sake of being a better father to Josh and Maddie going forward, but that it was work he needed to do as a separate person now, not as my husband, and that this distinction, which had taken me most of a year to fully believe myself, was not a punishment. It was simply the truth of where we both actually stood. I want to describe what my own life looked like by the time that first anniversary of the dinner came back around, because I think it matters to end this story there, in the ordinary texture of a life rebuilt rather than in the dramatic peak of the confrontation itself. I had, by that point, been promoted, somewhat to my own surprise, to a lead teacher position at Cedar Falls Elementary, mentoring newer teachers across the building, a role I had been quietly encouraged to apply for by my principal the previous spring, in the middle of everything else happening in my life, and had initially dismissed as bad timing before Denise convinced me that bad timing was exactly the kind of excuse I had spent 14 months refusing to let stop me from doing hard, necessary things. Josh had grown, over that year, into a calmer, steadier version of the guarded boy he'd been in the immediate aftermath, had made the varsity swim team that fall, and had started, slowly, rebuilding a relationship with his father that looked less like performance and more like genuine, if still careful, trust. Maddie had declared, with her usual confident inconsistency, that she now intended to become a marine biologist specifically, having narrowed her 3 earlier career options down to 1, and had also started that year quietly checking in on me the way children sometimes learn to check in on a parent who has been through something hard, small gestures, a note left on my pillow, an offer to help with dinner unprompted, That told me she had absorbed more of that year's lessons about resilience than I ever intended to teach her directly. Carol and I had, over that same year, become genuinely close in a way neither of us had anticipated when she first approached me by that drink cooler at the August cookout. Closer, in some ways, than most of the sisters-in-law I know from other families ever managed to become. Bound together by the specific shared experience of having both, in our own separate ways, chosen the harder, more honest path over the easier, more comfortable silence. She and Phil hosted Thanksgiving that year, the first holiday season after the divorce, and included Josh and Maddie and me without a moment's hesitation or awkwardness, seating me not at some careful diplomatic distance, but directly across from Dorothy, who had by that point made her own complicated peace with everything, telling me once, quietly, over the dishes that Thanksgiving evening, Elaine, I raised that boy, and I love him, and I am still so deeply sorry for what he did to you. Both of those things are true at the same time, and I hope you know you will always, always be my daughter in every way that matters, regardless of what paperwork says otherwise. I want to tell you about Denise, too, because a story about 14 months of quiet endurance would be incomplete without properly honoring the specific role she played in all of it. She did not simply give me a lawyer's name and then step back. She called me every single week of those 14 months, sometimes more, checking not on the progress of the case, which she trusted Priscilla to handle, but on the specific emotional weight of maintaining a double reality day after day, asking questions no one else thought to ask. Are you sleeping? Are you eating? Do you need me to come sit with you this weekend, even if we don't talk about any of it? She drove the 2 hours from her own house on 3 separate occasions that year, simply to sit in my kitchen and exist alongside me without requiring anything from the visit except companionship. And I have told her, more than once since, that I do not believe I would have made it through those 14 months with the specific steadiness I managed to maintain if she had not been on the other end of a phone every single week, reminding me why the patience was worth it. I also want to be honest about something smaller, something I have hesitated to include in telling this story because it feels almost too ordinary against everything else, but I think it matters precisely because of how ordinary it is. About 14 months after the divorce was finalized, roughly 2.5 years after that first credit card statement arrived in my kitchen, I agreed to a dinner with a man named Gordon Ashby, a widowed high school science teacher 2 years my senior who had transferred to Cedar Falls Elementary's district the previous year, and who I had gotten to know slowly, cautiously, over several months of faculty meetings and shared lunch duty before he finally worked up the nerve to ask if I'd like to get dinner sometime, entirely apart from work. I want to be clear that this story is not really about Gordon, and I do not intend to make him a large part of it, because I think there is something important in the fact that my healing was never actually contingent on finding someone new. It had already happened, slowly, deliberately, in the 2 years of rebuilding that preceded him. But I mention him because that first dinner, sitting across from a kind, steady, unhurried man who asked thoughtful questions and actually listened to the answers, was the moment I understood, with a clarity that surprised me, that I was not simply surviving my own life anymore. I was genuinely living it, curious again about what might come next, in a way I had not expected to feel possible sitting in that dry cleaner parking lot years earlier, watching my husband disappear into a building with a grocery bag in his hand. I want to go back, briefly, to something that happened about 18 months after the dinner, because I think it closes a particular loop that had been left open since that August afternoon at Carol's cookout. I ran into Renee Castellan myself for the first and only time, entirely by accident, in the parking lot of a grocery store on the edge of Cedar Falls, a store neither of us usually shopped at, which I have always privately assumed is exactly why neither of us had managed to avoid the other successfully for over 2 years, despite living in a town this size. I recognized her immediately, of course, from the profile photographs I had studied so carefully years earlier, though she looked, in person, both younger and somehow more tired than those careful professional photos had suggested, pushing a cart with a single bag of groceries in it, alone. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because I had imagined, at various points over the preceding 2 years, what I might feel if this exact scenario ever occurred. And I had imagined everything from cold fury to a kind of triumphant satisfaction. And what I actually felt, standing there in a grocery store parking lot on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, was neither of those things. It was something closer to a distant, almost clinical sadness. The specific sadness of recognizing another person's life had also, in its own separate way, been reshaped by the same set of choices that had reshaped mine, without any of the accompanying vindication I might once have expected to feel. She saw me too, I could tell, a flicker of recognition crossing her face, followed immediately by a visible uncertainty about whether to acknowledge me at all. And in the end, we did the only thing two women in that specific situation could reasonably do. We nodded once, small and wordless, and continued on to our separate cars, and I drove home that afternoon thinking, more than anything else, about how much energy I had spent, at various points during those original 14 months, imagining her as some kind of singular villain in my story, when the truth, standing in that parking lot, felt considerably more complicated and considerably less satisfying than any villain narrative could have offered. Marcus had made his choices, deliberately, over more than 2 years, choices that were entirely his own to make and entirely his own to answer for. Whatever choices Renee Castellan had made alongside him were not, I understood finally in that parking lot, mine to carry any further than that single wordless nod. I have thought often, in the time since all of this happened, about what I actually want my own children, and my students for that matter, to understand about the specific shape of what I did during those 14 months. Because I am aware that this story, told a certain way, could sound like a story about deception matching deception, coldness matching coldness, a woman becoming, in her own quiet fashion, as calculating as the man who wronged her. I want to be careful to say that I do not think that is actually what happened, and I've had a great deal of time to examine the distinction closely. Marcus's deception was built to take something from me, specifically, deliberately, over years, while allowing me to believe I still possessed something I did not actually have anymore, an intact, honest marriage. My patience, by contrast, was never built to take anything from him that was not already, factually, true. Every document I gathered, every date I recorded, every photograph I took, was simply evidence of something that had already happened, gathered so that the truth, once revealed, could not be argued away or diminished or reframed into something smaller than it actually was. I was not constructing a false reality for him to unknowingly inhabit. I was simply declining to hand him a preview of a true reality he had already, through his own choices, constructed for both of us. I think about the fourth graders I teach every single year, watching them navigate the particular small betrayals of childhood, a broken promise between friends, a secret told that wasn't meant to be shared, and I think about how the ones who recover best from those betrayals are rarely the ones who react fastest or loudest, but the ones who take the time to understand exactly what happened before they decide what to do about it, who refuse to let the person who hurt them also control the story of how the hurt gets addressed. I did not consciously model my own 14 months on anything I had learned from a classroom of 9-year-olds, but I recognize, looking back, that the same basic instinct was at work in both places, the understanding that patience, correctly used, is not passivity. It is simply the discipline of building an outcome you actually control, instead of reacting to an outcome someone else is trying to control for you. I want to tell you about Josh's swim meet that second spring, because it is one of the moments that best captures, for me, what the far side of all of this actually looks like once enough time has passed. He had worked his way over that year into a spot on the varsity relay team, a genuine point of pride for a boy who had spent most of middle school avoiding organized sports entirely, and the regional meet that spring fell, coincidentally, on almost the exact same weekend as what would have been our 18th wedding anniversary, a detail I noticed privately and did not mention to anyone. filing it away the way I had learned to file away most of the small, sharp reminders that still surfaced now and then, even years into rebuilding an entirely separate life. Marcus was there, in the stands, several rows away from where Maddie and I sat with Carol and Phil, and I remember watching him watch his son from that careful distance, applauding, genuinely moved when Josh's relay team took second place by less than a second, and feeling in that moment something I had not expected to feel again after everything, a kind of quiet, uncomplicated gladness that my son had two parents in that gymnasium who loved him, even if those two parents no longer occupied the same section of stands, no longer shared a single life, no longer pretended to each other or to anyone else that everything between them was fine. Afterward, in the parking lot, Marcus approached me, alone, Maddie and Carol having already walked ahead to bring the car around, and said quietly, "Thank you for letting me be here today. And I want you to know I understand, more than I think I've ever fully told you, exactly what all of this cost you, and exactly how much stronger you had to be than I ever gave you credit for being, back when I still believed you didn't know anything at all." I told him honestly that I appreciated him saying that, and that I hoped he continued becoming the kind of father Josh and Maddie deserved. And I meant it without any bitterness at all, which surprised me even as I said it. A small, clear sign of exactly how much distance 2 years of deliberate rebuilding had actually put between the woman standing in that parking lot and the woman who had once sat frozen behind the wheel of her own car 2 blocks from Birchwood Commons, watching her husband disappear into a building with a key already in his hand. I think, if I am honest, that the version of myself I have become since that anniversary dinner is not entirely a version I would have chosen if choosing had been available to me, because I would have preferred, given the option, a version of my life where none of this ever needed to happen at all, where the boy who handed me his jacket at that barbecue 18 years ago really was exactly who I believed him to be, all the way through. But that version of my life was never actually available to me. It had already been foreclosed, quietly, months before I ever opened that stray credit card statement, by choices Marcus made entirely on his own, and the only real choice that was ever left to me was how I responded once I understood what had actually happened. I chose patience over impulse. I chose documentation over accusation. I chose to let the truth arrive on my own terms, in a room full of witnesses, rather than let it leak out sideways in some smaller, messier, less complete way that would have left room for him to keep controlling the story even after I knew everything. I do not regret a single month of those 14 months, not because they were easy. They were, without question, the hardest sustained stretch of my entire adult life, but because I understand now, with a clarity I did not have at the very beginning, that the specific shape of how the truth finally arrived mattered enormously to how completely I was able to walk away from it afterward, whole, clear-eyed, and entirely unwilling to let anyone else's dishonesty become the defining fact of my own story. I want to go back one more time to something I have not yet fully described, a detail from the middle of those 14 months that I think illustrates, better than almost anything else, exactly how much the daily texture of that quiet surveillance actually asked of me, because I think it is easy, hearing this story compressed into a single narrative, to underestimate the sheer accumulated weight of maintaining it for well over a year. There was a particular Thursday in October, roughly 7 months into what I now think of privately as my documentation period, when I very nearly broke the entire careful structure I had built, not out of any external pressure, but out of a small, sudden, overwhelming wave of pure loneliness that arrived while I was folding Marcus's laundry, an ordinary domestic task I had performed 1,000 times before, and found myself, without any warning at all, sitting on the edge of the bed with one of his folded shirts still in my hands, crying in a way I had mostly managed to avoid up to that point, not because of any new piece of evidence, but simply because of the specific, exhausting loneliness of loving someone, in the complicated residual way you still love a person even after you've stopped trusting them completely, while carrying a secret about them that he had no idea you were carrying. I called Priscilla that evening, something I had rarely done outside of scheduled appointments, and told her through the aftermath of that unexpected crying that I did not know if I could keep doing this, if the specific loneliness of it was sustainable for however many more months this might take. She listened patiently and then told me something that I have returned to many times since, in many different contexts entirely separate from this specific situation. She said, "Elaine, what you're feeling right now is not a sign that you're doing this wrong. It's a sign that you're a person with a genuine heart trying to do an extremely difficult, unnatural thing. Hold two contradictory realities at once for the sake of protecting your own future and your children's stability. That tension is supposed to be hard. If it wasn't hard, I would actually be more worried about you, because it would mean some part of you had already gone numb in a way that would take considerably longer to heal from than this specific 14-month stretch of hard, deliberate patience. Cry when you need to cry. Call me whenever you need to call, and keep going, because you are closer to the other side of this than it feels like tonight." She was right, as it turned out, that I was closer to the other side than it felt like that particular October evening, though I did not know it yet, sitting on the edge of that bed with a folded shirt still damp from my own tears. I want to mention that Thursday specifically, out of all the difficult days in those 14 months, because I think it is important for anyone listening to this who might be in the middle of their own version of quiet, patient documentation, to understand that the difficulty of it is not a sign of weakness, and the moments of wanting to simply give up and confront everything immediately are not failures of resolve. They are simply the ordinary cost of doing something extraordinarily hard. And that cost does not disqualify you from finishing what you started. It is simply part of the price of finishing it properly. I think looking back across the entire arc of this story, from that first rainy credit card statement to the grocery store parking lot 2 years later, about how differently things might have gone if I had confronted Marcus that very first week, in anger, without any of the 14 months of careful preparation that followed. I think about Priscilla's original warning about women who react fastest often faring worst, financially and emotionally, in the aftermath, and I believe, with the full benefit of hindsight now, that she was entirely right. Confronting him that first week would have given him time to hide assets, time to construct a sympathetic narrative before anyone else in the family heard the full truth, time to potentially convince his own mother and sister that I was overreacting to a temporary lapse rather than a sustained, deliberate 2-year deception. Instead, by the time I finally spoke, on my own terms, in my own house, in front of an audience I had carefully chosen, there was no room left for him to construct any alternate version of events at all. The documentation spoke for itself, complete, dated, undeniable, and every single person in that room understood within minutes exactly what had actually happened, without needing to take either of our words for it alone. If there is one thing I would want to say directly to anyone listening to this who suspects right now, tonight, that something is wrong in their own marriage, some strange charge on a statement, some shift in a familiar routine, some small inconsistency that your gut has already noticed, even if your mind hasn't fully let you admit it yet, it is this: you do not owe your suspicion an immediate voice. I know how strongly the instinct pulls the other direction, how badly you want to ask the question out loud the moment it first forms, because the not knowing, even in that very first hour, feels almost unbearable. But I want you to consider, seriously, whether speaking immediately actually serves you, or whether it simply serves the discomfort of the moment at the cost of everything that might come afterward. Find out first. Understand the full shape of what you're dealing with. Talk to someone you trust completely, the way I talk to Denise, someone who will tell you the hard, practical truth, rather than simply comfort you into inaction or panic you into premature action. If it turns out to be nothing, if the charge has an innocent explanation, if the routine shift is simply stress or exhaustion or some unrelated private struggle your spouse is working through, you will have lost nothing by taking the time to understand it fully before you spoke. And if it turns out to be something, you will be enormously grateful later that you built your understanding before you built your response. Because the version of yourself who acts from complete information at a time and place of her own choosing will always be stronger than the version who reacts in the first raw hour of discovery. I also want to say something about the specific kind of strength this requires, because I think it gets misunderstood sometimes as coldness, and I want to push back gently against that characterization, because I do not believe what I did for those 14 months was cold at all. It was, if anything, one of the warmest things I have ever done. Warmth directed toward my own children, whose stability I protected by not letting our household collapse into chaos before I understood what I was actually dealing with. Warmth directed toward my own future self, the woman I would eventually become on the other side of all of this, who deserved to walk into her new life with clarity and resources rather than confusion and depleted assets. Even, in a strange way, warmth directed toward the possibility, however small, that I might have been wrong, that there might have been some explanation I hadn't yet considered, a possibility I wanted to rule out completely before I ever said a word that could not be unsaid. Cold would have been reacting instantly, out of pure wounded pride, without caring what happened to anyone else in the process. What I did instead took discipline and patience, and a great deal of quiet grief carried alone for a long time. But I do not believe, looking back, that it was ever cold. I believe it was the most careful, most protective, most fundamentally loving thing I could have done, for my children, and eventually for myself. I think, too, about what it means that I am telling this story at all. Now, roughly 2.5 years after that first credit card statement arrived in my kitchen, because I want to be honest that telling it does not come from a place of wanting sympathy or wanting anyone listening to feel sorry for me, because I do not, in any meaningful sense, feel sorry for myself anymore. I am telling it because I think there is real value for anyone who might find themselves standing in the kitchen I once stood in, staring at a piece of paper that has just quietly rearranged everything they believed about their own life, in knowing that it is possible to survive that moment and the many months that might follow it without losing yourself in the process. I am telling it because Denise once told me, in the middle of one of our hardest phone calls that year, that the reason she pushed me so hard toward patience and documentation instead of immediate confrontation was that she wished, desperately, someone had told her the same thing 8 years earlier, before her own faster, angrier reaction cost her $11,000 in assets she never fully recovered. I am telling this story, in other words, because someone else told me the version of it I needed to hear at exactly the right moment, and I want to be that same voice for whoever needs to hear it now. I still have the ring, incidentally, my own ring, the one with Always Us engraved inside the band, though I no longer wear it, of course. It sits now in a small drawer in my dresser. In the bedroom, I repainted soft gray, alongside a handful of other objects I have not been able to fully let go of. A photograph of Josh as a newborn, a pressed flower from my own wedding bouquet, a few things that belong less to the marriage that ended and more to the specific, complicated history of who I was before any of this happened. A history I have decided I am allowed to keep, even the parts that turned out to be built on something less solid than I believed at the time. I do not look at that drawer often, but I know it is there. The way I know the whole shape of those 14 months is there, permanently, folded into who I have become, not as a wound I'm still bleeding from, but as a chapter I lived through completely, on my own terms, and came out the other side of considerably stronger than I walked in. I think about Grace, my own mother's name. Incidentally, though this has nothing directly to do with my story, simply a small, quiet thought that surfaces sometimes about how many women before me have stood in some version of that same kitchen, holding some version of that same piece of paper, and had to decide, in the privacy of their own mind, before telling another living soul, exactly what kind of person they were going to choose to be in the months that followed. I do not know most of their stories. I know mine, completely, every single one of the 14 months of it, And I hope in telling it as fully and as honestly as I have tried to tell it here, that it offers something useful to whoever is listening tonight, whoever might be standing right now in their own version of that kitchen, staring at their own version of that statement, trying to decide what kind of person they are going to be about it. Choose patience if you can manage it. Choose documentation over accusation. Choose your own moment, your own room, your own audience, rather than letting the shock of discovery dictate the terms of how the truth finally gets spoken. And when you finally do speak it completely, without leaving room for anyone to argue their way around the edges of what actually happened. That is what I did, over 14 long, difficult, quietly determined months, and it is, without question, the single most important decision of my entire adult life, more important, in its own way, even than the marriage itself, because it taught me something about my own capacity for patience and clarity and quiet strength that I do not believe I would have ever discovered any other way. Josh turned 17 this past spring, and at his birthday dinner, a small gathering at our own house, just the three of us plus Carol's family and my own sister Renata, driving in for the weekend, he stood up near the end of the meal in a gesture that felt, watching it happen, like an unmistakable echo of the exact motion I had made at that anniversary dinner nearly 3 years earlier, tapped his glass of soda gently with a fork, and said he wanted to say something before the cake came out. He said, and I remember every word of it because I have replayed it in my head so many times since. I know this isn't really about my birthday, but I want to say, in front of everyone, that watching my mom handle everything that happened a few years ago taught me more about what it actually means to be strong than anything anyone's ever told me directly, because she never once yelled or fell apart in front of us or made us choose sides. She just quietly did what needed to be done until it was actually done. And I think about that a lot, especially now that I'm old enough to understand how hard that must have actually been for her the whole time. I did not manage to hold back tears at that particular moment, and I did not try very hard to. Maddie, for her part, is 13 now, deep into the specific intensity of early adolescence, still fiercely insistent on marine biology as her eventual career, though I suspect, privately, that this particular ambition may yet evolve once or twice more before she actually reaches college. She asked me recently, apropos of a school assignment about a person she admired, whether she could write her essay about me, and when I asked her, curious, what she planned to say, she told me, matter-of-factly, in the specific blunt way she has always spoken, I'm going to write about how you found out something terrible, and instead of falling apart, you got smart about it. And I think that's the best kind of brave, the kind where you don't even look brave while you're doing it, you just look calm, and everyone finds out later how much it actually took out of you. I told her that sounded like an excellent essay, and I meant it completely. I think, in the end, if I had to summarize what these 2.5 years have actually taught me, it would be something close to this. Betrayal, when it comes, rarely announces itself all at once. It arrives in small pieces, a strange charge on a statement, a ring taken off on Friday nights, a cologne you don't recognize. And it is entirely within your power, even in that very first moment of discovery, to decide that you will not let panic or hurt dictate the terms of how you respond to it. You can gather, you can understand, you can build quietly and completely the full shape of what actually happened before you ever say a single word out loud. And when you are finally ready, you can choose exactly when, exactly where, and exactly who witnesses the truth finally being spoken. And in doing so, you can ensure that the truth, once it lands completely, leaving no room for anyone to shrink it down into something smaller or more forgivable than it actually was. I did that. It took me 14 months, and it was the hardest 14 months of my life, and I would, without a single moment's hesitation, do every single one of them again. Before I close, I want to go back one more time to that very first credit card statement, the one that started all of it, because I still sometimes think about the specific accident of timing that put it in my hands at all. If Brannigan Supply had not switched accounting systems that particular March, If the paper statement had gone to his work email the way it was supposed to, I might have gone on for who knows how many more months or years, entirely unaware, still reaching into that tip jar of trust every single day without ever knowing it had already, quietly, been emptied out from underneath me. I do not know what to make of that accident of timing, whether to call it luck or fate, or simply the ordinary mathematics of the universe eventually catching up with a lie large enough to sustain. But I know that I am grateful for it. In the specific, complicated way you can be grateful for something that also caused you enormous pain, because it gave me back something Marcus had, without my knowledge or consent, been quietly taking from me for 2 years, which was the truth about my own life. I would rather have the truth, however painful, than the comfortable version of events I believed before that statement arrived. And I think that is, in the end, the single most important thing I want anyone listening to this to take away from everything I've told you tonight. The truth, even when it costs you everything you thought you had, is always, always worth more than the comfortable lie it replaces, because only the truth actually lets you build something real on the other side of it. I want to close with one final image, because I think it captures something about where I actually landed that no summary of legal proceedings or family reactions could fully convey on its own. It was this past Thanksgiving at Carol and Phil's house, the same house where Carol first asked me, standing by that drink cooler years ago, whether everything was really okay between Marcus and me. The table was full, Dorothy at one end looking older but steady, Carol and Phil at the other, Josh, tall now, nearly as tall as his father, helping Phil carve the turkey with the specific serious concentration of a teenager who has decided this is officially his responsibility now. Maddie narrating some elaborate story about a school project to anyone who would listen, Renata and Dale down from 2 hours away, and Gordon quietly, easily, seated beside me, having become, over the preceding year, simply a comfortable fact of my life, rather than any dramatic new chapter requiring its own separate announcement. At some point during that dinner, Dorothy reached over and took my hand, briefly under the table, the way she has done occasionally since that Thanksgiving conversation over the dishes, a small silent gesture that says, every time, everything she has already said out loud once and does not feel the need to repeat. And I looked around that table, at all these people who had chosen, in their own separate ways, at their own separate moments, to stand with me rather than simply accept the easier, quieter path of not getting involved. And I felt something I do not think I would have believed possible sitting in that dry cleaner parking lot years earlier, watching my husband disappear into a building with a key already in his hand. I felt, simply and completely, at home. Not in spite of everything that happened, not because I had somehow erased it or moved past it entirely, but because I had walked through all 14 months of it, and everything that followed, with my eyes open the entire time, and had built on the other side of it a life made of people who chose truth over comfort, every single one of them. The same way I had chosen it myself on a Tuesday afternoon in March, standing in my own kitchen, staring at a piece of paper that changed everything, and deciding in that exact moment exactly who I was going to be about it. Thank you for listening to my story tonight. If it meant something to you, if any part of it reminded you of your own quiet strength, or your own hard season, or simply reminded you that patience and clarity can carry you further than panic ever will, I would be so grateful if you would take a moment to like this video and subscribe to this channel, because stories like mine, real stories about real endings and real rebuilding, are exactly what we share here, every single day. Leave a comment and tell me, if you feel comfortable, whether you have ever had to choose patience over an immediate reaction, and how that choice shaped what came afterward for you. I read every single one, and I have learned over the past few years of sharing pieces of my own story that so many of you carry some version of this same quiet weight, waiting for the right moment to finally set it down. And I want you to know, whatever season you are in tonight, that the right moment is allowed to be entirely your own, on your own timeline, and no one else's. And if you know someone who might need to hear a story like this one tonight, someone standing right now in their own version of that kitchen, please consider sharing it with them, because sometimes the exact thing another person needs to hear is simply proof that someone else already walked through it and came out the other side whole. I think back sometimes to that first Saturday morning after I found the statement, standing at Marcus's side of the bed while he showered, holding that ring with "Always Us" engraved inside it, and I remember thinking, even then, underneath all the fear and the grief that hadn't fully arrived yet, that whatever happened next, I was not going to let someone else's dishonesty decide who I was allowed to become. 14 months later, in a room full of people who loved us both, I made sure of it. And every single day since, in the small, ordinary architecture of a life I rebuilt entirely on my own terms, I have made sure of it again. That, more than the apartment, more than the ring, more than any single piece of evidence I gathered along the way, is the real ending to this story. Thank you for being here with me tonight. I will see you in the next story.